The history of computers and their popularization is very much also a history of their representation in mass media. Be it the classic 1960s Star Trek style computer that if you tell it that love is not logical, it'll blow itself up, to the very hip and cool computer geek in his room who almost starts thermonuclear war in war games. These media portrayals were often sensationalized, often dramaturgically altered to be more exciting than the real thing, even though the actual excitement of this up-and-coming technology, what it could potentially do, and its future applications were really fascinating in and of themselves, just they didn't have the bells and whistles. Along, though, 40 years ago, came a show onto American broadcast television that was going to try to enlighten people, inform people, and give the nation a better understanding of the realities of computers, while still trying to make them very much things that we could address, that we could deal with, and also show us how they were going to apply to our lives. That show was the Computer Chronicles. And we're joined today by probably the preeminent source on information today on the web about that show. And he's going to walk us through all of this. Welcome to the show, S.M.Oliva.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you for pronouncing my last name correctly, because almost everybody gets it wrong.
How do they pronounce it?
They add an extra I, Olivia.
Olivia, really?
Yeah, it happens all the time.
Wow.
But, being a good European, I think you knew the correct pronunciation.
Yeah. I mean, granted, I've had enough people call me Karas in my life, so I guess, just an inherent thing. But so, okay, we've chatted back and forth on a variety of topics in the past. I'm really glad you're here on the show because we have, for those long-time listeners of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, we had discussed the original launch of Computer Chronicles, which actually happened 41 years ago as of the time of this recording in October of 2023.
42, actually, because it was
42.
81.
81, even better. So we're talking here about the milestone that is the nationwide broadcast of the show, but those are all details we're going to get into. So before we go back to the launch pad of Computer Chronicles, give me a brief understanding of, if you had to summarize what this show is, and it ran for a very long time, format changed quite a bit over the years, but if you had to summarize it for somebody in one paragraph, what would you tell them about it? And also, what about that made you so interested in this topic?
The Computer Chronicles was a 30-minute weekly news magazine that originally aired on public broadcasting stations in the United States. The original format of the national program was very much modeled on on traditional PBS news programs like Washington Week in Review. Later, as we get into the 1990s, the format tends to shift a little more of a consumer focus. But it basically was just a weekly news magazine. There were various segments. Some of the segments were features where they would, talk about a news item. There were product demonstrations, and in the original concept of the show, there were a lot of roundtable discussions. Just, 3 or 4 people sitting around a table talking about a computer-related topic. In terms of my interest, I first conceived of this idea about 6 or 7 years ago. I conceived of the idea long before I actually put it into practice. And originally, it wasn't even about a historical interest. It was more of, I'm actually a professional blogger by trade. I write blogs mostly for law firms these days, so I've been blogging in different capacities, going back to the early 2000s. And I'm always looking for new ideas for blogs. And my original concept was a lot different. It was much more of I used to read a lot of blogs about where, you'd recap a television show like a Grey's Anatomy, that kind of thing. And I thought, what's a show nobody would actually try to recap? It was in my head originally, it was going to be much more snarky. And I really wasn't even into the whole history aspect of it. And I had the idea, and I just put it aside for a while to work on other projects. And then about 2 or 3 years ago, well, almost 3 years ago now, I actually did start to get more interested in the history of computers and gaming. And I started watching some of the retro YouTubers, folks like Clint over at LGR, those kind of folks. And in terms of the specific path that led to this blog, I would say that one of the YouTubers I started watching, although I guess she doesn't do it much anymore, was Kelsey Lewin. And Kelsey used to make videos about strange things like the sewing machine for the Game Boy, that kind of thing. And that kind of revived my interest in some of the more obscure things I remember seeing in old Chronicles reruns. And then I later learned that she was doing a podcast with Frank Cifaldi over at Video Game History Foundation. And that's when I learned there was a Video Game History Foundation. And it was through their podcast that I heard people like Alex Smith and people like Kevin Bunch. And then I would say after that, I started listening to Alex's podcast. I would say listening to Alex's podcast is really what jump-started me into dusting off this old idea and actually doing it as a somewhat serious project, looking back through each episode.
And I can definitely see that. I mean, Alex's podcast also influenced mine in a big, huge way.
Yeah.
As far as the seriousness of the topic, because, my original concept for Video Game Newsroom Time Machine was also a bit snarkier. It had originally been a blog a couple years before that with a slightly different format and a different name. But, there I let the snark out quite a bit more, and that died down when I realized that you could do a more professional take on understanding the history of it and still make it entertaining.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, your current work is to basically go through each episode, each season. What exactly is the blog doing?
Yeah, so each blog post covers a single episode of the show. Now, I will say I'm not a completionist. There are episodes I skipped for one reason or another that I don't feel the need to get into right now. But, for example, there was an episode about computers and children. And basically the entire episode was the host Stuart Chaffee, talking to kids about basic programs they made in school. And I'm like, there's nothing to really talk about here, and I don't really want to track down a bunch of people who appeared on a TV show. There was really nothing for me to talk about in terms of the blog, so I just kind of skipped that one.
Gotcha.
But I've covered most of the episodes so far that from the first 4+ seasons. There were 20 seasons in all. I've done 105 episodes as of when we're recording this. So each blog post covers one episode. There's a recap, and then after the recap, I basically go back and say, okay, here are the people and products that were featured on this episode, or the companies, and I try and track down what happened to them.
Now,
with varying degrees of success.
Okay.
And
I know that cycle. Let me put it that way. So, okay, now let's get into the show itself.
Sure.
So we're going back to 1981.
Right, and probably a little before that. I don't know. I'm a little, a lot of the early prehistory is still kind of very fuzzy. I actually thought it would be helpful. I'm going to kind of have to pull an Alex here and go back even a little further to sort of set the stage.
Please do.
Because we kind of have to start by talking about the guy who created the show, Stuart Chaffee. He was the executive producer and host for all 20 years. I think there's only one episode he did not host. in the entire
of the national
run. So we'll get into that.
And I think we need to be very specific here. For those who aren't familiar with
this is why I want to start with Stuart's backstory, because Stuart's backstory will lead us into how everything came about.
Okay.
So Stuart Chaffee actually started out much like yourself as a lawyer.
It's always a good start.
Technically, he started out as a math teacher. He was from Philadelphia originally. Well, he's still alive. He's from Philadelphia originally. Attended college in Southern California, went to USC, got a math degree, and then he returned to Philadelphia and taught math for a year, and then decided he wanted to go to law school. So he went to Harvard Law School, which is a good place to go to law school.
If you're going to go anywhere, I mean, yeah.
It's no Florida State, but, you know.
That's true. I mean, they don't have our cachet or football teams.
So, well, yeah. Harvard's the Florida State of the North. But so he went to law school, and rather than going into practicing law, practicing in terms of like going to a law firm or something like that, he actually ended up working in as an in-house lawyer for television news departments. I think he started out at NBC News, and then I think he was at NBC, and then he was at ABC, I believe. He was at both of them. I forget in which order. And while he was working in the legal department at ABC News, he started doing on-air reporting on legal matters. I believe he actually covered the trial of the man who assassinated Robert Kennedy.
Oh, Sirhan.
Yeah, so so this is we're talking like 68, 69 when he starts becoming an on-air reporter. And then in the early 70s, he takes a literal and figurative left turn and actually spends the next 7 or 8 years working in various jobs in the Pacific region. He takes over as the manager of a television station in American Samoa for a couple of years. And then he ends up in Honolulu in Hawaii, where he basically works as a news director for a radio station, then for a television station there. And then in 1978, he returns to the mainland, and he decides he's not happy in commercial news broadcasting anymore. So he takes the job in 1978 as the general manager of KCSM, which is the public television station, which was, I don't think it exists anymore, but KCSM was a public television station owned and operated by the College of San Mateo, which was a community college right in the middle of Silicon Valley. And I guess we should probably briefly explain what PBS is for non-American viewers. It's not a national broadcaster the way you would think of like the CBC or the BBC. PBS is basically a loose confederation of locally owned nonprofit stations. And the way PBS essentially works is every PBS station kind of makes programming for themselves, and then sometimes they will share the programs through a national exchange with the other stations. So when Stuart took over at KCSM, one of his jobs was to develop local programming. And as he's recounted the story, he was a computer geek. He wasn't a technologist necessarily, but he was the kind of guy who would go out and hang out at Radio Shack or attend computer user group meetings, that kind of thing. And I think his first computer was a Tandy. I think he had a TRS-80 when it came out. And, they were in Silicon Valley, and he was a computer enthusiast, and he basically thought to himself, or I guess he had a meeting with his producers and said, what if we create a televised computer user group meeting? And that was basically the original concept, was a computer user group meeting, but we're just going to televise it. And they developed this as a local program that premiered in September of 1981. And that program, it was called the Computer Chronicles, but it was a live program. It was done live on Thursday nights, and it was hosted by a man named Jim Warren. Now, people who are aficionados of computer history may recognize that name, Jim Warren. Jim Warren was one of the early tech journalists. He started a lot of early computer publications and newsletters, and he was best known as the creator of the West Coast Computer Fair, which I'm sure you've talked about at some point.
Oh, yes.
He created it. I mean, for the first several years, he ran the event. It was his event.
Oh, okay.
And so he basically knew everybody in the industry. And so he basically stepped in as the host for the first year. We don't know much about the first year. They didn't keep any recordings of it. I found one clip that somebody uploaded to the archive. A very brief clip of Jim Warren talking to some unknown person about an Atari 8-bit program of some sort. And it's like a minute and a half, and it's the only footage I have ever seen of this show.
Wow.
So literally there is no footage. Stuart Chaffee has no recordings of it. We know virtually, I didn't know much about it until you actually, the first time you communicated with me, we were both on Twitter at the time, and you had sent me a thing about an article in one of Jim Warren's newsletters about it. And that's the first time I saw any kind of information about the original program.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And looking through Jim Warren's newsletters, I was able to reconstruct a partial episode list. But again, no footage. And we also know, I also went through television listings from the time period, and there were other stations that picked up this local program. Now, according to Stuart Chaffee, when he was asked about this years later, the way he described it was that, it was a local program. It was never meant to be a national program. But people in Silicon Valley started talking about it on early bulletin board systems with people around the country, and other computer geeks would call their PBS stations and say, "Why aren't you airing this?" So about 20 other stations did eventually pick up the Jim Warren show, and that's actually, I think, where we got that surviving clip, I think, came from a Pennsylvania station that somebody had taped.
Okay.
But, so that show aired in 81, 82, and then in 82, 83, there was nothing. But then in 83, Chaffee decided to actually revive. He decided that there was enough interest from the PBS stations around the country to do a national show. And I think there might have only been 30 or 40 stations that picked it up the first year. At its height, it was on about 200 stations. So, I mean, it was a popular show, and it got syndicated around the world, and other stations picked it up. But, yeah, so when the national show came around in late 83, Chaffee decided to host it himself because he had experience as an on-air journalist, in addition to being, the GM of the station. And yeah, so that's how we get to the launch of the show in October of 83.
Okay, now a couple of questions I would have. So we have this slow expansion of the Warren version of it. Now, do we have any idea why or why Warren wasn't asked to continue? Did Warren not want to continue? What was...
I don't know, because again, there's so little information available. I don't know. My guess would be that, Jim Warren was a busy guy. He had a lot of... he was running the West Coast Computer Fair. He had other projects. And I think I also think Chaffee just decided if you're going to do a national... Well, I think part of it also goes to when they decided to do it as a national program, it kind of shifted from user group meeting to let's do Washington Week in Review, which was Washington Week in Review, if you don't know, is another PBS show, which I think is still on the air, which is basically like a weekly news magazine where they talk about American politics.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So I think part of it is Chaffee decided he was just going to host it because it was now going to be more of a serious news magazine type show rather than just the Jim Warren spitballing type of show. But gotcha. I don't think there was any kind of falling out between him and Warren. I don't think it was anything like that, though.
Okay.
I think it was just a format change.
Yeah, and I've seen interviews with Chaffee where, it doesn't really seem to, there didn't seem to be any animosity there or anything else. Okay, so we have this tiny little show that's trying to capture the energy of the early hobbyist, enthusiast computer scene, and now is morphing into something in 83 that is more in line with, informing a general public or opening up the doors to a general public because that's what a news magazine is supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and it's funny you talk about energy because the first season did not have a lot of energy, if we're being honest. And it was a slog to it was a slog to recap some of those early shows, partly because the very first season was actually not sponsored by, but one of the major participants in that first year was SRI International, the Stanford Research Institute. They provided
and who were they?
So SRI International is basically a kind of like a for-profit think tank almost. They're kind of just sort of a general research arm that spun out of Stanford. And kind of like a Xerox PARC type of situation. And they actually worked with Chaffee to produce the first season of the show as a college course. I don't know if you've ever seen this. If you go back and watch some of the first season episodes, you'll see these interstitial segments hosted by somebody else, which was part of the college course. So they actually made a 24, there's 24 episodes, 26, and they actually turned it into a college course with these interstitial segments with a textbook. There was an actual Computer Chronicles textbook, which you can find on the archive. It was, and that was put together by a man named Herbert Lechner, who appears in some of the first year shows. And when you see Herb Lechner, never has a man screamed more, "I worked at IBM in the 50s" than Herb Lechner. And he did work at IBM in the 50s. He is sort of the paragon of the old school mainframe guy. And he's very professional, but it's a very dry, straightforward presentation you get from Herb. And Herb would actually host these interstitial segments that were part of the course. So the first season of the show was very much about introducing people to the various concepts around computers.
Yeah.
It was not as lighthearted as it would become, relatively speaking, in later seasons.
And is Chaffee the sole main host at this point, or does he have somebody to play off of?
No, Gary's there, so we should probably get into Gary Kildall at this point. Gary Kildall was the principal co-host for the first 8 seasons, from 83 to 90. And I'm sure that name has come up before on your show, and I'm sure anybody listening to this show knows who Gary Kildall is.
I always...
At least they know the name. They recognize the name.
Stan Lee said, every comic book is somebody's first comic book.
Well, people recognize the name even if they don't know the story.
That's true.
So, Gary Kildall was the founder and chairman of Digital Research Incorporated, DRI. DRI was the first commercial software company to manufacture an operating system, which was known as CP/M. And, having Gary co-host this show, I think the easiest way I can explain it to a video game audience is, imagine if in 1982 there was a half-hour show every week about video games co-hosted by Nolan Bushnell. Because I mean, not that they're the same kind of... I mean, they're both very friendly men with beards, but other than that, I don't think Gary had the same personality as Nolan necessarily.
No.
But in terms of... You're talking about a foundational figure in terms of computer software.
Yeah. Now, do we know how that involvement came about?
Sort of. Stuart's talked about it a little, but so basically, just to give a brief overview of Gary was an academic. He had a PhD in computer science. He basically got into computers in college. I think he attended the University of Seattle, and then he ended up at the Naval Postgraduate School because he got. So I should go back a little bit further. Gary's paternal grandfather had actually started a college for merchant marine sailors in the Seattle area. They taught seamen. And Gary actually started his career teaching navigation at his grandfather's school. And at one point, he basically was being groomed to take over the family business, but he just wasn't interested in that. So he went to college and started getting into computers. And then then through his family connections, he got a Navy officer's commission because he didn't want to go to Vietnam.
Yeah, that's
because this was around 68.
Motivation.
And he ended up studying at the Naval Postgraduate School, which is in Monterey, California, which is about 2 hours south of Silicon Valley. And while he was at the postgraduate school, he was doing so well with computers, they basically asked him to stay on as an instructor. And he basically was a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School. And in the early 70s, while he was an instructor there, Intel hired him to write a very simple, what they referred to back then as a control program. This wasn't even really an operating system. It was just a control program for their early microprocessor. I think it was the 4004. I'm not an expert on processor technology, but it was one of the very first Intel microprocessors that he wrote this control program for. And, again, this was just sort of an academic consulting gig. And, Intel could have easily said, you know what, this is great. We're going to market this thing and build it into an OS. Intel had no interest in software. Nobody had interest in software back then. And so Gary decided, again, Gary was always a reluctant businessman. And at least according to Gary's accounts, Gary actually credited Jim Warren, of all people, with kind of pushing him into the idea of, why don't you commercialize this and build a company? So I suspect Jim Warren was the person who introduced Gary to Stewart. I don't know that. Unfortunately, Jim Warren died in 2021. I would have loved to have interviewed him.
Oh, wow, yeah.
But he passed away. I don't know what happened, but I'm pretty sure, because I believe Gary appeared on the Jim Warren version of the show as a guest at some point. We have a guest listing where his name shows up. So I assume that Stewart knew of Gary through Warren. Now, as Stewart tells the story, he originally approached Gary about being an underwriter, because even though PBS in the United States doesn't have commercials, they do have sponsors who underwrite the show. They still have expenses to make the show. So they do have companies underwrite the show.
Yeah.
And actually, Stewart said that originally he approached Apple, and he almost had a deal with Apple to be the presenting sponsor, and then a certain someone at Apple threw a temper tantrum. I'll let you guess who that certain someone was.
I'm sure that his job has sounds something like employment.
Yeah. So that fell through. And then he actually talked to Digital Research. And the actual sponsor ended up being a company called Micro Focus. But at one point when Chaffee was making the rounds looking for sponsors, he kind of talked to Gary to gauge DRI's interest. And as Chaffee tells it, basically when he was talking to Gary about sponsorship, that's when he realized that Gary would be a good co-host. Chaffee basically brought Gary in. And I think the reason he brought him in was, even though Chaffee was a very trained TV host and journalist, he wasn't an expert in the technology. He wanted a co-host who knew the technology sector from that end. And, Gary was a very mild-mannered, very respectful guy. He's not a media personality the way we would think of them today, but, he knew how to present himself, and he was, again, one of the founding fathers of the software industry. So, I think he gave the show instant credibility.
Oh, definitely. His appearances on the show, you can always tell he's got the right questions at the right time, at least from the.
Although I will say, Gary was a bit of a mumbler, which makes it hard when you're trying to write a recap.
I will also agree with that. Like I said, great questions as far as technology is concerned. There's a few episodes where his questions about other aspects of it are just a little off, but that's another issue. We can also try to put this in a historical context, and this is probably also important. When this version of the show launches, we are dealing with the video game crash or I should say, while they're developing this, and it must have taken them at least 6-7 months to get this version of the show off the ground, I'm guessing.
I believe the other problem too is the first season. The metadata for the first season is kind of a mess, and we don't have we have a rough production. We know the production order. I don't know all the initial broadcast dates. I believe they started taping the show in late September, early October. Now they would have begun pre-production in July or August probably for some of the tape segments, but October is when I'm pretty sure the show went into actual production.
Gotcha. So the microcomputer industry, the Texas Instruments crashing, all of that's happening as they're putting this show together.
Right, and we should also probably briefly mention the whole thing with DRI and IBM, because that's kind of also a setting the stage thing.
Yeah.
So and again, this is a fairly well-known story, but I don't want to spend too much time on this. But basically, CP/M was sort of the first commercially available operating system, and it was very popular on machines that were based on the Altair 8800 architecture, which was sort of the early microcomputer standard. Well, IBM, of course, releases the personal computer in 81, and as the story goes, IBM approached DRI about licensing CP/M for the PC. Something happened, and what happened is a matter of historical debate. And what ended up happening was they did license CP/M. And I think this is what's misunderstood. You could get CP/M on the PC, but IBM also licensed an operating system from Microsoft, which was called PC-DOS originally. And PC-DOS was basically the default. If you wanted CP/M, you had to pay extra.
You had to pay extra, and it wasn't available at launch.
Right.
It comes months later, so...
Now, in terms of what happened, I don't really want to get into that here because there's a lot of missing. But suffice to say, by the time this show premieres in '83, the PC-DOS standard is really starting to take hold because now we're starting to see clone makers. Compaq has come out with their PC clone. We're not quite in the full... The clones haven't really started to take off yet. IBM's still kind of in control of things, but... we can see the clone makers coming, and PC-DOS is now essentially the standard. And digital research stays in business until 1990, so it's not like they go away.
No, they're going.
They continue to develop a lot of products, but because again, I think the urban legend is that DRI just kind of drops off the map after the IBM deal. That's not what happened. But yeah, we're definitely living in the PC world now when the show premieres, and as you said. The video game market is in the middle of its collapse, and the home computer market, the Texas Instruments Commodore War, which I know Alex has done a lot of wonderful work talking about on his podcast, is in full swing. So yeah, and we're in a world now where IBM is kind of setting the standard for the microcomputers.
Yeah, and so is. From your review of the first launch episodes, let's say the first 4 or 5 episodes, as far as we can tell their creation order, is that something that is talked about, that is they're trying to put that in perspective, or is that bent towards this is an online or a broadcast course?
So the first episode, which I'm actually my next, I do a podcast as part of my blog. My next podcast will actually be going over the first episode.
Oh, okay.
So the very first episode was mostly kind of a general overview of how we got to microcomputers. So it's very expositional. The very first demonstration was actually a machine called the Hewlett-Packard 150. Are you familiar with the HP 150, Carl?
No.
So the HP 150 so this is a period of time now where you're starting to see clones, and Hewlett-Packard was mostly a company known for developing machines for the professional and engineering markets. They were known for calculators primarily for the engineering market. And they were starting to realize, hey, this micro thing is taking off. Maybe we should do something about that. And this wasn't their first personal computer. I think they had a couple of other models they released in '82. But the 150 was them basically trying to come out with an MS-DOS compatible machine. Wasn't a PC compatible. I think it had a different BIOS, but it was DOS compatible.
Gotcha.
And so the head of HP's computer group at the time, a fellow by the name of Cyril Yonsouni, came on to demonstrate the 150. And the 150 had one big gimmick. It had a touch screen. Now, you might be wondering, how do you have a touchscreen computer in 1983? Because that seems like way too soon to have that sort of thing. And it really wasn't a touchscreen, exactly. Are you familiar at all, Carl, with the Broderbund U-Force controller?
Oh, of course.
Which I know Norm Caruso did a wonderful thing on.
Yeah.
This was kind of the technology, and again, I'm being very reductive here, but what HP did with their touchscreen was kind of along the same lines as the U-Force. It was basically, there were infrared sensors in the monitor bezel, and when your finger hovered over the screen, it broke the infrared beams, and that's how the computer knew where your finger was.
That's the same technology that they were using in ATM machines in the early 80s.
Although this, I think, was a little before the ATM machines started coming out. So I don't know. It might have. I don't know. I don't know when ATM machines like that started coming out. But yeah. So it was a touch screen, but it wasn't really what we would think of today as a touch screen. It was more like a hover your finger screen. But HP thought this gimmick would sell a $4,000 PC, which they sold some. It wasn't a complete flop, but it's interesting that this ended up being the first episode, I think, because it was showing how, it was showing how a company like HP, sort of the oldest company in the Valley, basically, was starting to get into micros. And it was showing that if the micros weren't a fad necessarily, it was still an area where there was a lot of companies trying to get into the market, at least on the business end, not so much the low end, as we know from the home crash. And that's the other thing, too. In the first few seasons, the stuff you're seeing on Computer Chronicles really is, for the most part, the high business end of the market. They will do episodes on the lower end stuff. I actually will be covering an episode they did in '88 on the Commodore 64. So they would occasionally slum it.
That's the episode where they're talking about the user groups of people who are still sticking with their C64s?
Yeah. That's a March '88 program, and one of the demos is a retired woman who made a program to help her with her knitting.
Yeah.
But yeah, certainly in the first couple of years, it's really about a high level overview of the micro industry, and the products they're talking about tend to be the higher end products. Now, I think the second episode, at least the second production episode, this one really interests me because it involves two things I know you've talked about with Alex. The second episode was about what they were referring to at the time as integrated software. This revolutionary concept of what if we could have a spreadsheet and a word processor and a database all in one, not just separate programs. And the two things they demonstrate were Vision and the Apple Lisa.
Yeah. And we've been talking
two
about
products
this a lot,
that. Yeah, I know you've talked about Vision recently.
Yeah.
And Vision was VisiCorp. VisiCorp were the people who did VisiCalc, and they were trying to put together an integrated software package. I'm not entirely sure it ever actually launched commercially, but they demonstrated it on Chronicles. And of course, the funny part about the Lisa demonstration was this was October of '83 when they recorded. Apple was already preparing to junk it in favor of the Macintosh 2 months later.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the Lisa was basically dead when the program aired.
Yeah. Well, and Vision does launch, but it's so slow. But then again, the Lisa was so slow that neither one of them is really a useful device at that point.
So again, I'd say if there was a theme to the early shows, a lot of it was just, here are the things that are going to be possible in a few years. Well, the other first season episode that I remember is they demonstrated the very first color laser printer from Xerox. And this was a prototype. This was not commercially available in 1984. This was color. I mean, there were black and white laser printers. And Stuart Chaffee gave an interview a couple of years ago where he basically said, yeah, we had to take the doors off the studio to even fit the thing in. It was so big. And it caught fire when they were setting up the demo.
Nice. Nothing.
And if you watch the episode, there is a very awkward cut during the demo where there's a different guest who shows up, and it's clear that's when the thing started to smoke, and they had to bring a technician in to fix it. And they got the demo off. I mean, it was a great demo. But again, this was basically hypothetical technology. This wasn't even consumer technology in this first year. A lot of it was just sort of, here's what the future is going to be, touch screens and integrated software. So a lot of it was very forward-looking to start out.
And over time, the show seems to become more and more a platform for companies to show off their latest products.
Yeah, I would say starting in season 2, they get rid of all the SRI academic stuff. That's only from the first year. And I think Chaffee really starts to get a sense of what he wants to do with the show. And it's still very much, in the early years, it's very much this roundtable discussion show. And I should say, for people who haven't seen it, every episode was about a specific subject. So they would do an episode on the Macintosh. They would do an episode on financial software. So every episode had a theme, and there would usually be in sort of the classic period of like 84 to 90. there would be a couple of remote segments. There was a reporter who in the early years was Wendy Woods, who I've gotten to know a little bit. And Wendy would do sort of remote segments where she would usually go to like a local business in San Francisco to say, here's how this business is using whatever it is we're talking about this week, and trying to give practical hands-on examples. And then there would also be 2 or 3 segments in the studio where they'd have people come in and do demos, basically.
Yeah. And we'll probably talk about some of the more famous ones, the ones that get a lot of hits online, like the wonderful let's show off the Atari ST and the Amiga at the same in the same episode.
Well, I feel like we should get to, but before our friend Ethan Johnson starts screaming at his podcast player, we should talk, because I know he's waiting for me to bring up this demo. This is, of the 105 shows I've blogged about so far, this is by far the worst demo of all of them. And it happens to be a video game demo. And that, of course, is the RDI Halcyon. Are you familiar with the Halcyon, Carl?
No, the Halcyon. RDI Halcyon.
Okay. I know you're familiar with Dragon's Lair.
Of course. Oh, and everybody remember, show notes, lots and lots of links in the show notes.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay, sorry, I just Googled it. Please continue.
So, Dragon's Lair was developed by, the technology was developed by a guy named Rick Dyer. The animation part was done by Don Bluth, but Rick Dyer was the guy who developed the actual, Dragon's Lair technology. Well, he decided to develop a home video game console based on that technology. Now, I actually was just talking to Ethan over the weekend, and Ethan actually told me, and I didn't know this, originally the Halcyon was going to be based on RCA's optical disc technology, not the laser disc. But then I think something fell through there, and at the last minute, Dyer had to redevelop it for Laserdisc.
Wait. When you say RCA's optical disc, are you?
I forget.
You're not talking about their vinyl discs.
Maybe you'd have to ask. Honestly, I'm not going to say anything because Ethan will correct me, and because Ethan knows this tech, I don't. But all I know is it originally started out as a different technology, and then had to be reworked for Laserdisc at some point.
Okay.
So this was the idea behind the Halcyon was this was going to be a home Laserdisc console for gaming, and there was a prototype. Dyer made a bunch of prototypes.
Yeah.
And he brought one of them onto Chronicles to do a demo. And years later, in the early 90s, after he'd retired, Gary Kildall wrote a draft of what would have been his memoirs. Unfortunately, Gary passed away before he could finish them. And in his draft memoirs, Gary basically refers to this as by far the worst mistake the show ever made, was putting this thing on the air. Because I should mention, Carl, not only was it a Laserdisc game console in 1985, or it was 85, it was also voice-controlled.
No. So
imagine doing Dragon's Lair with voice control instead of the joystick.
Oh, okay.
And so they set up the demo for the game. They had a demo adventure game of some kind. And they had Stuart do the demo, because Stuart has a very clear broadcastery voice. And he's trying to do the voice, and it doesn't work. I mean, the thing just flat out doesn't work.
And he's playing Dragon's Lair.
No, it wasn't Dragon's Lair. It was another game that had been developed for this console specifically.
Okay.
I don't remember that. I'd have to pull up my own blog.
Probably Thayer's Quest or something like that.
That's what it was. It was Thayer's Quest.
Okay.
Yeah, so Thayer's Quest was developed for this thing originally. And then I guess it was later released as a standalone game after the whole Halcyon, because the Halcyon never made it to market.
No. I mean, it's... No.
I mean, the demo, and again, had this thing made it to market, it was going to be like a $2,000 system. I mean, you thought the 3DO was a bad idea.
Well, I mean, it's insane because Coleco had originally purchased the rights to Dragon's Lair for a home release, and they had even talked about the possibility of a Laserdisc version. And yeah, the RCA technology was there.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I just looked at my own blog post. It was gonna come out. It was going to be a $2,500.
Oh, Jesus Christ!
And again, this was, as we just talked about, we're in the middle of a video game and home computer crash, and Rick Dyer thinks he's going to pull off a $2,500. Again, even if it had worked, who would buy it.
Well, and let's face it, the whole Laserdisc game fad fizzles out within 6 months. I mean, it's such a flash in the pan, with everybody realizing the limitations of the gameplay that selling this. I mean, there's going to be people in 1990, 91, or 92 even, more precisely, who are going to be selling systems like this in Europe.
My other favorite thing about the Halcyon, there was one other game developed for it, and this was also, I think, later turned into arcade cabinets. And this concept just makes me laugh every time I think about it. They had an NFL licensed football game as their other launch title. Now you're wondering, what does this look like? They took clips from actual NFL games, and so if you're playing the game, you tell the machine, I want to pass the ball, and it will pull up a clip and show you a clip from a real NFL game of the ball, and then it'll either succeed or fail depending, I guess, on the program. But they actually used real NFL clips to make the game, which I just find hilarious as a concept.
Have you ever played? There's a World Wrestling Federation game on the Commodore 64.
Micro League Wrestling.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Never played it. I owned an Apple II. I played a lot of Micro League Baseball on the Apple II as a kid. I've seen the wrestling game. I've seen clips of it. Yeah,
it's exactly that. It is exactly that. Only the clips are made up of maybe 7 frames of very small window digitized C64.
But I believe like Thayer's, because Thayer's Quest and the NFL Football were the only 2 games developed for Halcyon, and I think they were both. You mentioned Thayer's Quest. That came out as an arcade cabinet, right?
Yeah.
And I think the NFL thing, I've never been able to find hard evidence of it, but I believe the NFL game, because there were actually 2 variants. There was an Oakland Raiders, San Diego Chargers variant, and then there was a Washington-Dallas variant. So there were 2 variants of the NFL football game. And I have a vague recollection of seeing the Washington-Dallas one as a kid at some point. So I think it did come out as a standalone cabinet.
Yeah, no, we've actually covered it at some point on the show and I can't remember the configuration of teams, which version it was, but there was a preview at least of that coming out, and I would have to check my notes on the show whether or not it ever actually hit. But I do believe, I'm just looking right now here.
I've said, well, you can find clips of the demos on YouTube, because there are some retro YouTubers who found Halcyons, and I've seen the San Diego Oakland variant.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's got to be out there someplace, and I know I've seen footage of it as well. Whether or not it's been emulated is another issue entirely. But.
So yeah, this episode, so that demo was, I think, March of '85 is when that demo aired. So this was even before the Nintendo was out in North America.
Yeah. Well, and so okay, so I'm curious now why Kildall sees it as such a failure. Did he see it as a failure because it just didn't work when they were showing?
Well, so okay, that's a good question. So Gary didn't have an issue with the Laserdisc. In fact, Gary loved Laserdisc. We might even get into that a little bit. Gary loved the actual optical tech. No, Gary's specific objection was to the voice stuff, because what happened during the demo was Dyer kept trying to sell it as artificial intelligence, because it had voice recognition. And that's what pissed Gary off. Because Gary did not like... Because again, some things never change. Even in the mid-'80s, people were trying to spin their bad tech as AI enabled.
Yeah.
And Gary's point, which he made in his memoirs, was... And this is perhaps not Gary's best prediction. You can be the judge. Gary basically said... Gary focused on the whole voice command thing, and he basically said, I don't think natural language computer programming can ever work. Like he didn't think using natural language to program a computer was a viable technology, and that was what he was actually focused on more than, not so much the game part of it. I don't think he cared about that.
Gotcha. Okay, so, and this I think brings back another issue, or it dovetails back into what we were talking about. Who is the target market for this show? So the original version with Warren is clearly targeting the enthusiast crowd. Who is the target market Chaffee is going after when they go national?
Setting aside that demo, for the most part, it was a show focused on I would say consumers, but mostly business consumers as opposed to home consumers. Because, again, a lot of the episodes were about more mundane things like tax preparation software. For the most part, it was about stuff that was commercially available, and it was, we're going to sort through a bunch of different examples of this technology that you can buy now and what should you buy. But, yeah, the intermingled with that was a lot of pie in the sky. Here's stuff that people are working on that may be viable 5 years from now.
Gotcha.
For example, another episode I was just screening recently, and little bit of a shout out to our Gaming Alexandria friends. I was doing an episode on early PC scanners from like 87, 88, and some of the earliest PC scanning technology. Here's a 300 DPI scanner that costs $5,000. So,
yeah,
it was available. You could buy them. Do you have $5,000? But So, it was practical in a sense for a certain kind of business consumer. But no, if guys like you and me who grew up playing Apple IIs and Commodore 64s, it probably, for the most part, wasn't necessarily aimed at us most weeks.
Gotcha. But I guess it also would have had that aspirational aspect of, hey, you may just be playing a C64 today, but look what's on the horizon.
Right, and obviously there was a lot of, as you said, there's a lot of, in this, I'm currently covering the 87-88 season, so there's a lot of talk about, 386 machines which are starting to get onto the market, the Atari ST, the Amigas, the two Apple II GSs, so they're talking about contemporary stuff that is available. They're not, the Halcyon was more of an exception, not the rule, I would say, at this point.
Gotcha. Now, and so we've got this first year, and going into the second year, they've dropped the whole idea of the educational aspect. You've got credentials with somebody like Gary Kildall on there. And they're getting more and more attention from the companies. Now, do we have a feel at this time, because there's so many companies coming on to show their products, be it software, hardware, etc., who's doing the contacting? Are they actively being approached by companies to get time on the air?
Yeah, so let's go back into a little bit of what we know of the production. So one thing I should point out, one of the big changes that occurred between the first and second years, so this would have been the summer of 84. Stuart Chaffee actually leaves KCSM at the end of the first year. He wants to go back to the East Coast where he's from, and he actually ends up becoming the president and general manager of a PBS station in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And he remains there for the next 9 years, I think. So what happens is Computer Chronicles continues to be based in San Mateo at KCSM. And so what actually ends up happening is he basically works a full-time job at the Harrisburg station, and then every other weekend he commutes to San Mateo and tapes 2 episodes on a Saturday.
Interesting.
And he basically does this for the next 8 or 9 years, I think, until he leaves that. He ends up leaving the Harrisburg job in the early 90s, I think. So, yeah, he's basically commuting. It's basically it's essentially his second job. And, yeah, the way the show basically works is he has a production staff. And as I said, at the beginning of each season, I think they would create an editorial calendar and say, okay, here's the 20 topics we're going to discuss this year. And then his producers would seek out guests to fill spots for each of those shows. I'm sure they were eventually getting people saying, can we come and pitch your product? But it was always based on what their calendar was and what their topics were going to be that week.
Gotcha.
And it's also worth noting that as we start to get further into the show, I'd say around late season 2, early season 3, they start doing remote episodes where they're covering trade shows. So they're covering Comdex, they're covering CES, they're covering Macworld. So they'll do entire episodes focused on just trade shows where they're walking the floor and talking to vendors.
Yeah, and now and again, here, or not again, but here I do have to clarify, I never saw the show as it was airing.
Nor did I, actually. I only watched it as reruns myself in the 2000s.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But I have watched a tremendous number of episodes since after I found out about the show on YouTube, going on 20 years ago now. Before YouTube, but the episodes were basically on different locations online that could be found. So now my question is, the interstitial segments that were news segments that seem to be part of the show starting at some point.
Oh, you mean at the end of the show?
Yeah, there were little news segments.
I guess I left that part out when I was describing the show. So yeah, it started in the first year, although because most of the first year recordings we have are from the academic course, those cut out the news segments, but the news segments were always there from the beginning.
Okay. And so
after the show, after the main program ended, there would be roughly about a 5 to 6 minute news segment called Random Access. And originally Stewart himself did it, but then later other news anchors, I think later on it was other news anchors at the Harrisburg station took over that role.
Oh.
So because that part was, because I know when we get into the late 80s, one of the main anchors is Maria Gabriel, who's a longtime public broadcaster in Pennsylvania. So I think as the show went on, because those were just news segments they filmed in front of a generic news set. They didn't need to be in San Mateo for any of that.
Well, and also, I mean, if Chaffee is doing 2 episodes in a row, and you have these editorial bits where they're going out to trade shows and whatnot, obviously the news is going to get stale. So if you wanted to actually have news that was up to date, you're going to have to do that as a separate segment.
Yeah, and this actually creates. See, I used to recap the news segments on the blog. I stopped doing that because a lot of the episode recordings we have are actually reruns, and you can tell because the news segments, the timeline doesn't match up with the broadcast order of the episode. So that's why I stopped recapping, because I was going between 2 different time frames. It just got too confusing.
Okay, so just so I understand, the news. So they would do. They would
update the news segments every week, even when they were doing reruns in the summer.
Oh, really? That's actually fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, a lot of it, once you start looking into it, like I am, a lot of the episode recordings we have are reruns, sometimes a year later. So that's why I don't recap the news stuff anymore. The other thing I should mention about the news segment, because he's also become sort of a friend of the blog, the news segments would also, in the first, up until around 92, there would also be a software review segment hosted by Paul Schindler.
Yeah.
And Paul, I think actually at this point, maybe we should get into some of the other contributors on the show, because there were a number of other regular contributors. Maybe we can talk about them.
Yeah, definitely.
For a little bit. So, I mentioned, so Paul Schindler was, so again, starting in that first year, Stewart decided he wanted to do kind of a weekly software review segment. And, he actually auditioned 2 people, Paul Schindler and Esther Dyson, and they were both already established tech journalists. Esther Dyson edited a prominent industry newsletter, and Paul had been in tech journalism since the late 70s. He was an MIT graduate actually, but he went into journalism for some reason. And so Paul would do weekly software reviews up until around 92. And he remained a contributor for most of the run. He would occasionally be a guest co-host, and he would participate in certain segments in studio up until around 99. And actually, he ended up leaving the industry in 99 to become a 8th grade history teacher.
Interesting.
So he went into academia, and I've actually spoken to Paul many times. He's a very, very nice man. He's retired now in his early 70s. And so he was one contributor. Another contributor I've mentioned already is Wendy Woods, who I've also had a chance to speak with online. And Wendy was the regular beat reporter for most of the 80s. I forget exactly when she stopped. It was around 89, I think, or 90. And she would basically be the beat reporter who did all the, outside segments. And she was also the editor-in-chief of News Bites, which was one of the first, if not the first, online publications covering the computer industry. News Bites actually started out as part of The Source, which was an early online news service. And then when The Source went into the crapper, I think she moved over to CompuServe for a while. And then eventually News Bites was purchased by the Washington Post Company when the World Wide Web became a thing. And she remained the editor with the Washington Post until that project was shut down, I think also around 99.
Interesting. Okay, now, this seems like there's... basically, the relatively small world of computer and high-tech journalism that exists at this point of time is coalescing around the fact that there's finally a televised output or televised forum.
Yeah, and there were a lot of other. Oftentimes, when they would do the panels, they would have a computer journalist on the panel discussing, like if they were discussing printers, they'd have a PC World editor on to talk about, because the magazine may have just done a thing on printers. So, a lot of the guests were tech journalists, and this was probably where a lot of them got their first TV exposure, I would think. Yeah.
Now, do we know anything about how those contacts were made? Was it...
Not really. Not really. We don't know a ton about the production history of the show. Aside from the few interviews that Stewart's given, there's not really any kind of definitive account. Like I said, I only learned about the fact that Esther Dyson was up for the software reviewer role because Paul Schindler told me that.
Oh, okay.
He said it was down to him and Esther, and but I don't have a ton of information about how the show was produced in that sense. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. And
one other contributor I wanted to mention from this early period, because again, he's another figure who's actually very important to the tech industry, but has become largely forgotten, is George Morrow. George started making appearances, I think, around season 3. There were a couple of seasons. I think season 3 and it was season 2 and 3 or 3 and 4. I can't remember. There were a couple of seasons where there was also an end of episode commentary segment, kind of like the old Andy Rooney 60 Minutes bit. Mm-hmm. And Paul did it for 1 year, and George Morrow did it for 1 year. And then George became kind of a rotating, because Gary Kildall was often absent because of his other obligations. So they would bring in substitute co-hosts, and George was one of them. And are you familiar at all with George Morrow?
No, the name isn't ringing a bell. I probably recognize him if I saw him, but...
George was he was the middle-aged bald man you often saw in some of these 80s episodes. But he was another early industry pioneer. He was the founder of a company called Morrow Designs. And the Morrow Designs was one of the companies that got into the micro business before IBM did. They were one of the companies that made pre-assembled CP/M-based machines. And kind of like he was part of that group, like with Osborne and Vector Graphic, that sort of early run of companies that kind of got wiped out once IBM took over the market.
Gotcha.
And so George, George was a guy who, he was a hardware guy, much like Gary was a software guy. George was the hardware guy, and he'd run a company that was successful for a few years, but around 85, 86, it kind of all started to fall apart for various reasons. But he ended up becoming another regular contributor on the show. So I think that's an interesting aspect, is that Stewart would bring in industry professionals, it wasn't just journalists or pundits. I mean, there really weren't that many pundits. It was either people who were working journalists, who were industry analysts who worked for analyst firms. There were people like Jan Lewis and Tim Bahardt who came from that part of the industry. Or it was people like Gary and George who actually worked in the industry and ran companies that were in the industry.
And, I mean, I guess there's two aspects to that. Number one, if you're trying to talk to business people who are buying these very expensive machines, having, industry professionals giving you commentary about it is going to add that credibility and help that. On the other hand, I mean, these people really, really know what they're doing, and in a certain sense, it gives it still that old enthusiast or hobbyist feel, because at their core, these guys who started the industry started it with that.
Yeah, and I mean, and George Morrow was one of those people. George Morrow came out of the Homebrew Computer Club. He was one of those people.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he was a contemporary of those guys. So he was very much a hobbyist who got into the business. But although it's funny because, you have industry analysts, and the thing about the industry analysts was, much like pundits today, sometimes they would get a little too excited about their predictions for the future, and not all of them came to pass. And I think it was Jan Lewis who said on one episode, this was after Steve Jobs had left Apple, and I think Jan Lewis went on the show and said, "Well, I think that's the last we'll hear of Steve Jobs." I wish she'd been correct, but she wasn't. Or another one, to bring it back to gaming, actually, because one of the other regular features they would do on the show is every year there would be a holiday episode where all the regulars would gather around and sort of recommend tech gifts for the holidays. And I remember one episode where Wendy and Paul were in the studio on the panel, and Wendy was recommending an Electronic Arts game. And Paul chimes in, I haven't seen this game myself, Wendy, but, Electronic Arts has never released a stinker.
Oh.
I don't think anybody would say that today about Electronic Arts.
You know what? In the first batch of games, there's a couple of stinkers. So ironically, the game that Wendy was talking about was a game called Thomas Dish's Amnesia. Are you familiar with Amnesia, Carl? Amnesia? No. EA's Amnesia?
So this was the only text adventure EA ever released.
Oh, okay. Now I remember it. Yeah, no.
Alex has talked about it, and I think Jimmy Mayer certainly talked about it. And, well, it's interesting because this game, Thomas Dish was a science fiction author.
Yeah.
And his book publisher, I think he was published by Harper and Row, and his book publisher initially was going to get into the software business. This was during the whole bookware fad.
Yeah.
And they commissioned an outside developer to put together this text adventure game. And Dish came in with like a 300-page script for the game. And everybody was very excited about it. The development company really liked it. But then the publisher pulled out. They decided they didn't want to get into software. The only reason the game ended up at EA was because of your friend, Don Daglow. Daglow was a huge Tom Dish fan. He loved Dish's sci-fi. And this was the era when the producers ran the roost at EA. So he bought the game over to EA. Although apparently, Daglow's given interviews about the game on other podcasts. As Daglow put it, if they had done the entire game as written by Dish, they would have needed 6 or 7 floppy disks. And Tripp was like, no, you get 2 or 3 or whatever. I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 disks. You're not getting 6 disks for this monstrosity. And I don't think it sold too well. I don't know the exact numbers, but both Daglow and the guy who ran the developer have given interviews and basically said, yeah, it didn't really sell well.
No, I mean, come on. It's coming out in 1986 and it's a text-only game.
But of course, Wendy Woods, and this is where I think there's some disconnect between the show and the audience. Wendy Woods, who was a, mid-30s tech journalist, she loved the game and she raved about it for like 5 minutes. And she was basically the audience for this sort of thing, I guess.
Well, yeah, but the problem is that she's, if you're buying this as a gift for somebody, aka, let's say, a kid or something, that's.
And this was the same Christmas that EA released The Bard's Tale. Which was a much more, that's an easier sell to, I think, more of a teenage audience than a kid audience.
Well, also The Bard's Tale made the absolutely brilliant move of being available on the C64. That was its whole selling point.
Yes, Carl, we know you had a C64 as a kid.
But that was the whole point. Wizardry wasn't on the C64 yet. I mean, it was like, here's the first graphical dungeon crawler that has C64 graphics. Go for it, kids.
Right.
And that was actually in their advertisements for it.
Well, and another thing that's come up, and I've written about this on the blog, in a couple of those mid-'80s Christmas episodes, and again, I don't mean to harp on Wendy, because Wendy, and I like Wendy, I've talked to her, she's a very nice woman, but Wendy would also, during these Christmas shows, harp on what was then a big fad in the mid-'80s, which was, video games are out. What's in are robot toys and talking dolls. And there was one holiday, it was the 87 episode, which I just reviewed, that holiday episode, where she brought out Julie. Julie was a talking doll from our good friends at Worlds of Wonder.
Ooh.
And Julie was going to be their big seller for the 87 holiday season. It wasn't a big seller for the 87 holiday season. And in fact, and this is where going back through the show and looking at the timeline matters, they recorded that episode, and again, the funny thing is, Wendy demonstrates Julie, and the demo doesn't go all that well. It wasn't the Halcyon-level disaster, but it's clear this talking doll isn't all it's cracked up to be, but Wendy was like, no, I think this will be a good toy for the season. 2 or 3 weeks after they taped the episode, Worlds of Wonder filed for bankruptcy. The company was dead 3 weeks later, and Julie didn't go anywhere.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's face it, it's 87, and I'm looking at a picture of Julie right now. Now that's some nightmarish looking design.
Oh no, Carl. That wasn't the worst of it. There was an even worse product on that episode. And I had this one as a kid.
What was it?
Wendy wasn't done with Julie. She also demonstrated another talking toy called Mr. Game Show from Galoob.
Mr. Game Show.
Look it up. I'm going to get some water, Carl, while you look that up.
Okay.
I'll be right back.
Dear listeners, now you're getting the real live thing. Mr. Game Show from Galoob. As I give this into... and nothing's more entertaining than hearing somebody do a Google search, right? So, Mr. Game Show, a board game. And what does Mr. Game Show do? And yes, in case you want more details about the game.
Okay, sorry, I'm back now, Carl.
Check out my 4.5 hour long interview with Don Daglow. So, let's see. Mr. Game Show. Oh, my Lord.
Yes. It talks, Carl. It talks.
So what we're looking at right now, and it links in the show notes below, is basically a cheap-looking ventriloquist dummy.
I think it was a plastic figure that was. Yeah, I think that's a good description. It looks like a demented ventriloquist dummy. It's supposed to be a TV game show host standing behind a podium, and you put cassettes. There are games that come on cassette. And the cassettes make it talk, and then you basically play like Wheel of Fortune style guessing games with it, essentially.
Wow, yeah, that's going to have an appeal of about 20 minutes?
Well, and again, Wendy really loved it when she talked about it. And now, to be fair, unlike Julie and Worlds of Wonder, Mr. Game Show didn't sink Galoob. It almost sank Galoob, but didn't quite sink Galoob. And because the other thing to keep in mind is, I think both Julie and Mr. Game Show were retailing around $100 in that holiday season, and this is when you could get the Nintendo for $70 at this point.
Oh, Jesus.
You know, this was the 87 Christmas, which was the 87 Christmas the best sell year for the NES?
87 is probably, that's peak NES. 88 was also a brilliant year, but by then the install base was already quite...
And as I point out in my blog post, at no point during this holiday episode do they even mention the NES, but they advertised these two monstrosities. Which, you know, this shows you where there was still a bit of a disconnect between the tech press and the consumer and what consumers were actually interested in.
Yeah. I mean, or at least a bias against game consoles.
Well, a bias in the sense that they thought it was a dead market. I mean, there's actually, they do a computer games episode in 85 or 80. I think in 85 they do a computer game episode. And so one other thing about the program was Stewart would often tape a cold open, sometimes on location, to introduce the subject. When he introduced an 85 episode of computer games, he was literally standing next to a $1 discount video game bin at a local game store, and he was literally holding up an ET cartridge for $1.
Oh, man.
I mean, it is literally the stereotype image of the crash. So, yeah, I think when it comes, and again, I'm not trying to harp on Wendy or the show for putting these things on the air. What I'm saying, though, is they all thought that the robot toys would be the new thing that would take over for video games. They really, that was kind of the conventional wisdom in the tech press at that point.
Well, I mean, and Nolan Bushnell jumped on that bandwagon in 83.
And Wendy also demonstrated one of Nolan's toys in an earlier episode. I forget which one, but it was something that came out of Axelon.
Oh, okay.
Which was his company. So yeah, they mentioned that. Well, you know, have you ever heard of Tech Force? I think it was called Tech Force. Are you familiar with this one?
Yeah, Tech Force I'm familiar with.
Yeah, so yeah, Nolan was part of that whole rigmarole too. Well, you know, it's funny, when I was researching Worlds of Wonder, I found an article. And this was after the company had gone public, and they were on top of it because Worlds of Wonder made their name with Teddy Ruxpin. That was their first big hit that launched them.
Yeah.
And I remember reading an article where they're talking about the fact that because Don Kingsborough, that was his company, And the newspaper article was gushing about how this was going to be a successful company. Like, how can it fail? He's brought all these former Atari people over.
Oh, Jesus Christ!
It's like, did nobody learn? It's like, so sometimes the tech press has amnesia, not the game amnesia, but it's like, did you guys not just see what happened to Atari a year ago?
Well, I mean, if you look at it from that standpoint, I mean, he's saying that at the same time that Activision, even though they're massively declined, is still surviving in the computer industry made up of Atari people. Accolade gets founded, made up of Atari people. The Commodore Amiga, designed by Atari people. So yeah.
Actually, Carl, at this point, not to steer your podcast, but I thought it might be helpful to actually talk about how they covered computer games in this period, since you are a game podcast,
of course.
A game history podcast. So, Electronic Arts was pretty much the house company of early Chronicles. Whenever they needed somebody, they would just call EA, because EA was literally down the street. This was when they were in San Mateo, and they were literally like 2 miles from the studio. So, I have a joke where it's like you can't go 3 episodes of the show without EA showing up. And actually, it was the 3rd episode where we get the first discussion of Electronic Arts.
Mm.
And the 3rd episode, so this would have been one of the October 83 records. It was an episode, it wasn't about games, it was about computers and music. And one of the guests was a guy named Will Harvey, who developed an early EA program called Music Construction Set. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I'm familiar, and I'm also familiar with Will Harvey because he made Zany Golf.
Yeah, and so Will Harvey was a teenager. He was literally a high school student when he appeared on the show. He was still in high school.
Wow, really?
Yeah, he was like 16. I forget. I think I did the math when I wrote the post up. He was like 16 at the time, or 17.
Wow.
And he was a teenager in Northern California, and he got his first computer, I think, was a Commodore PET. And it was one of these, like, his parents, his parents agreed to go half in if he, raised the money, the other half mowing lawns or whatever. And so he wasn't starting out in games at all. He just wanted to program. And then he got an Apple II a couple of years later, and he decided to try making an Apple II game. And he made a game called Lancaster, which was basically just kind of a Space Invaders clone. You can find it on the archive. It's actually a pretty good Space Invaders clone for the Apple II. Not a clone, but it was a Space Invaders style game. It wasn't a clone. But the interesting thing was, he wanted to have music in the game.
Okay.
But he wasn't a musician. So he wrote a very simple program to transcribe sheet music into music that the Apple II could produce.
Okay.
And so he did that. Another publisher, EA didn't publish the game. He took the game to another publisher who published it. That publisher quickly went out of business. And so then he was shopping the program around again, and he went to talk to EA, and I don't know if he met with Tripp or whoever who was doing production back then. And they basically said to him, well, we're not interested in your game, because we don't want to make a Space Invaders clone, but we're interested in the music transcription program. Could you develop that into a standalone program? And that's how they got Music Construction Set. Now, EA had already published Pinball Construction Set, which was Bill Budge's game. Now, and again, these two things were not related. Bill Budge had nothing to do with Will Harvey and vice versa. But EA got the idea of putting the Construction Set label on it to kind of create informal branding. And they would actually release 2 more games. They did Adventure Construction Set and Racing Destruction Set.
EA is very good at creating branding.
Yeah. So a few months into the first season, and I don't know the exact production date. I'm guessing it was February or March of 84. That's when they do the first proper episode about computer games.
Okay.
And, of course, the featured guest is Mr. Trip Hawkins himself, who appears with Bill Budge. And they talk about Pinball Construction Set, and they talk about the one-on-one game with Dr. J and Larry Bird. And it's basically the canned Trip Hawkins simple, hot, deep spiel that you've heard 100 times by now, probably. You, not the listener. You've heard it 100 times, because I know you're big into Trip and EA history.
Yeah, it's Trip Hawkins' absolutely well-developed, well-polished, yet very canned approach to marketing.
What's interesting though is they usually did 2 or 3 panels. So the one panel was the EA panel with Trip and Budge. The other panel is actually very interesting to me because the other panel was about Atari. And again, keep in mind, this is 1984, so this is when Atari is almost well and truly dead in its original form. It's a few months, it's a few months before Jack takes over what's left of it. And the demo, the first person who appears, and, I was relatively new to video game history when I started writing the blog at this point. I had never heard of Chris Crawford before I saw him on Computer Chronicles. Oh, boy.
That must have been an experience.
Oh, boy. Well, first of all, looking back on it, Gary said the biggest mistake Stewart ever made was the Halcyon demo. No. The biggest mistake was not putting Tripp and Chris Crawford on the same panel together. Because that would have been like the ultimate meeting of good and evil, and which depends on your perspective. And Crawford was there to talk about a game he'd written for the Atari 800 called Excalibur. And I'll tell you, after writing that blog post and after doing the research, I still have no idea what that game is about. I think it's supposed to be a very primitive version of Crusader Kings. Where it's like you're supposed to build an alliance and become the King of England, but it's like navigating menus and screens. Like, I don't really know what the game is supposed to be, and the demo didn't help me at all.
Because it's a Chris Crawford game. If you've ever tried to play a Chris Crawford game, that's the general experience regardless of what you're doing or not doing.
The other game that was demonstrated, which was a very interesting thing, the other game was demonstrated was actually a 2600 or VCS game. But it was the most esoteric VCS game you could find. It was called, I think it was just called Space Shuttle, and it was literally a space shuttle simulator.
Yes,
Are you familiar with this? Which was fascinating. I mean, it was a fascinating thing to watch, but it's like, you guys literally picked probably what would be the least popular game for like a 6-year-old.
And
a real-time space shuttle simulator, we should emphasize.
Yeah, and I mean, it's almost, the question I'd really love to ask Shafei at this point is, who's making the decisions of what to put on there? I mean...
Well, he has produced. I mean, they have producers. I mean, they had Sarah O'Brien was the main producer, I believe, through most of the run, and it would have been her job probably to actually find the guests and whatnot. Well, again, I think Space Shuttle was published by Activision at one point. I don't know if it started out at Activision, but I think that was an Activision game because Activision was also a local company in these days. They were down the road. So there was a lot of you would often see the Activision guys show up. David Crane famously did the program to demonstrate Ghostbusters. The mother of all C64 games.
All the good stuff was C64 games. Okay, but we'll
I know.
leave that there for now.
But the other thing too is like you fast forward a couple of years, so like the next computer game episode was like 85, 86, and they spent an entire segment talking about Mac games. And I said this in the blog post. Who is buying a $2,500 Macintosh to play chess? Because one of the games they demonstrated was Sargon. It was a chess game. And the other game, you want to get there. So they always did 2 demos per segment. So this was 1986, and they're doing Mac games. The first game was a chess game. Take a guess what the other kind of game was they demonstrated. Not the name. What kind of game was the other demo for a Mac game? A stock market simulator.
Christ.
Yeah. It's like, really, guys?
But then again, it's a Mac, so...
I understand, but like, why would... if you're going to do an episode... Because the next segment was the C64 segment with Crane doing Ghostbusters, and I'm like, okay, you're showing the different ends of the spectrum, I get it, but it's like... Again, no one's buying a Macintosh to buy a stock market simulator.
Yeah, that's true.
You're going to buy the $100 C64 and play Ghostbusters. Although, interestingly enough, one of the remote segments in that episode, one of the Wendy Wood segments, was, and this may have been the earliest video footage of Lucasfilm games.
Oh, really?
Yeah, this is before they got into the adventure games. This was when they were doing Rescue on Fractalus and Ball Blazer. And she interviewed the developers of both those games, David Levine and David Fox was the other developer. And I've actually spoken to David Fox. Just online casually, he found my blog and we chatted for a bit. But so, I mean, they were showing things that were coming on the horizon, but it's also like they were also very enamored with the Macintosh. I mean, I've joked on the blog, if there's a Computer Chronicles drinking game, you take a shot every time Gary refers to the Macintosh having high resolution graphics. Because Gary was just obsessed. Gary was obsessed with the high resolution graphics on the Mac, which again was 192 pixels wide? But it was high resolution. It was monochrome. But okay.
And we have to define here, monochrome is two colors, black and white.
Black and white.
No gray tone.
Yeah, so they literally did. Yeah, so they were talking about Macintosh gaming on a black and white system. And now I recently covered, to bring it up to where I am now in my chronology. So I'm currently reviewing the 87-88 year, and they actually did a 2-part series on computer games. So now computer games are getting taken more. They're still not talking about video games. They're still not going to admit the NES exists. But they are starting to talk more about computer games. They're still talking about a lot of Mac games like Dark Castle. But, which again was an impressive demo. I mean, at least Dark Castle was a good game. But, well, the one that got me was, one of the games was Silicon Beach software that did that. They did another demo of a Silicon Beach game called Apache Strike.
No, have you seen this one? Like a Choplifter clone?
Have you ever not played, but have you ever seen demos of Simcopter from the 90s?
Yeah. The
Will Wright that in black and white wireframe.
No.
Yeah. It's a 3D wireframe game on the Mac. I couldn't calculate it. It looked to me like the demo was maybe 10 frames a second.
Oh, Jesus.
You know, I mean, and the demo ran okay. Like, it didn't crash or anything. The game played okay, but there was no frame rate to it.
Why would you bother? I mean,
well, and the funny thing is, and again, this is the benefit of my blog where I look into the history. And actually, there's a guy named Richard Moss who recently wrote a book about Mac games. Yeah. This is where I got a lot of the research out of. Basically, within like 6 months of this Chronicles episode, Silicon Beach said, we're not doing games anymore. We're just going to do other, like, you know, actual software for the Mac that's going to sell.
That makes perfect sense.
Like graphics tooling. Like, they got out of the gaming business almost immediately after that demo. But then like the next segment was like Accolade demonstrating Mean 18, which was a huge selling golf game. And again, it was in color, like actual color. Ooh, pretty.
The scary part, I just checked here, Apache Strike was also ported to DOS and the Commodore 64.
Yeah, I'll send you the links to my blog because I covered all this.
No, we'll definitely put links to it in the show notes. I mean, because that's...
The other thing I should mention from this episode, this is the one time I've done an actual interview for research. Because in general, I look at news articles, and I don't do a lot of interviewing because otherwise it would just slow down the process too much, as you know.
Oh, I know, yeah.
But I was very curious because, you know, in this 2-part episode on computer games, most of it was about EA, Silicon Beach, Activision, all companies I'd heard of before, like, you know, Accolade. But they did a couple of demos from a company I had never even heard of before called PBI Software. And I'd never heard of this company. And the demo was on air. They were doing games for the 2GS, which is probably why I never heard of them. But I actually tracked down the guy who owned PBI Software. And I interviewed him on the phone. Didn't do it for podcasts, but and it was one of those. He was very amused that anybody would ever think to talk to him about this. And it wasn't the most dramatic story. Basically, it was a guy named William Lowe, and he basically ran this small company for about 5 or 6 years, just making software and hardware for mostly Apple. It was all Apple products. He made stuff for the 2GS. He made stuff for the Mac. And he published a couple of games. And basically the only reason he was making the games was because he was trying to sell sound cards for the 2GS.
Interesting.
Because apparently the 2GS was capable of stereo sound, but you needed an add-on card to actually produce stereo sound.
That sounds like a typical Apple design decision.
So his company, PBI, made the board, and he figured, well, I should probably make some games to go along with the board. And again, there was a teenage coder selling a game. He bought it. It was called Tower of Miraglen, which is actually, I played it. It's not a Zelda clone because it was before Zelda. It looks and plays a bit like Zelda, like the original Zelda. It's a perfectly competent 2GS game, and the sound is quite good. So it was by no means a bad game, but it was basically this obscure company. And I asked Lo, like, what happened to your company? And he's like, I got bored after a couple of years, and I just, paid the bills off and shut down. He's like, the way he said it to me was, I realized the industry, you had to grow to stay competitive. I had no interest in trying to keep up with EA or Activision. And it's like, I had a good run, sold a few products, and he's one of these guys who just creates a lot of small businesses. He was actually in the middle of starting a new company when I talked to him. And he's not in tech, but he's like a local San Francisco guy who just started up a lot of businesses. And, in the early 80s, he thought, I'll try doing software and hardware for Apple. Well, how hard can it be?
That's fascinating.
And I asked him, going back to what you've been talking about, I even asked him, like, how'd your company end up on Computer Chronicles? And he's like, I'm not sure. I think somebody from their production staff just called us. Because they were, again, literally down the road.
Yeah.
And, it's funny, so I should mention, the guy who made Tower of Miraglen, I don't have his name in front of me, the guy who made the game, who's another one of these teenage bedroom coder types, right? He makes the game, and he's like, well, I'll sell it to Electronic Arts, because everybody knows EA. So he gets in his car and he drives down to San Mateo. He gets lost looking for the EA building and he finds the PBI building instead. So he's like, I'll try these guys instead. And he walks into the lobby and Lowe's just standing there talking to somebody and he talks to Lowe and he's like, will you buy my game? And he's like, if you make it for the 2GS, I will. Because I think he made it on a Mac originally.
So is this Richard L. Seaborn? I'm just looking at the credits.
No, Seaborn was the programmer. Yeah. And he went on to have, Seaborn went on to have a very long career on the production end of gaming. So it's in my blog post. Like he made a couple of more games for PBI, and then he made a couple of more. I think he made a game for EA, he made a game for Activision, and kind of got into the back end of production. He just retired. I think he retired not too long ago. So this guy went on to have a career, but it's just sort of a great story of the early days where, like, I was going to sell the game to EA, but then I got lost. Looking for their building, and so again, PBI was literally right down the street from KCSM. So because the one thing we do know from what Stuart Chaffee said is, this was a very low budget production Chronicles. If you appeared on the show, you had to get yourself there. They weren't flying people in to come be on the show. So that's why a lot of these local companies like EA and Activision would get so much airplay, is because they could just get in their car and drive up to the college. In fact, from what Gary said in his memoir, I've never confirmed this with Stuart, but Gary said they actually recorded the show in the early years in a basement on the college campus.
That would make perfect sense. I mean, since they were a college PBS station.
Right. I mean, but just the idea they were in the basement. They weren't even like at a ground level. It's like, no, you have to do this in the basement. But I just found that funny. It
makes perfect sense. I mean, otherwise you'd probably hear the arcade games over in the student union.
Yeah.
So what we have here is a television show being made on a shoestring budget in a non-commercial station.
Yeah.
By an enthusiast who has clearly identified a hole in the market, that there is this growing interest in computers, this growing need for information about computers to be disseminated, and he is putting this show out there with heavyweights in the industry, largely accessible because of the location of the filming, because it happens to be in Silicon Valley. It's all
right, and remember, as I said, he's literally commuting from the East Coast every 2 weeks to make the show.
Now, it seems very perfect timing, right place, right time, etc., etc. Were there, to your knowledge, any attempts to take the show out of the quote-unquote ghetto of PBS and try to make it into a more commercial product?
Stewart did give one interview. I found one interview he did around 87 or 88 where he talked about two things. He said they were looking into the idea of developing a commercial TV version as well as a version of the show for kids. Now, neither of those things happened. But yeah, he was thinking about it.
I mean, it only makes sense. I mean, there must have been some kind of interest in that. If you look around the same time, late 80s, early 90s in Europe, you're getting more and more of this kind of content on television. But then again, in Europe, you also have a much stronger PBS sensibility because of the government-run or government-financed television.
I think the main reason he never went the commercial route was because at that point you're basically just doing commercials for the companies who demo products.
Gotcha.
Because I know he's talked about that, and again, he was a PBS guy. He was he stayed at the Harrisburg station up until the early 90s. So I mean, he was committed to the idea of public broadcasting at that point because of his role because again, he was the GM of two different stations.
Gotcha.
In PBS.
Now, you were right. I mean, it would have been hilarious to have Chris Crawford and Trip Hawkins on the same stage. From the episodes I've seen of the show, I don't recall any moment when they actually had any kind of confrontation set up where,
Nah, not really. Well, okay, so I have come across one story about a conference. Are you familiar with the name John McCarthy?
No.
I know Alex knows about John because he talks about him quite a bit in his book. John McCarthy was the father of artificial intelligence. He ran the Stanford AI lab, and he appears in one of those first season episodes when they're doing a lot more academic stuff. There's an episode about AI. Well, I later learned through research that McCarthy's appearance was rescheduled because the first time he was scheduled to appear, he walked off the set. He walked off the set because he was scheduled to appear on a panel with another guest. I forget. I don't have the name handy. It's in my blog. But one of the other guests that was scheduled was an ethics professor, I think at Berkeley, who was a critic of AI. And McCarthy's like, "No, I'm not appearing with a critic of my work." And he just wouldn't show. He refused to walk onto the set. And he got in his car and left. Wow. Apparently. And they ended up rescheduling the show without the other guest. The other guy ended up appearing in a later episode, so there was, I guess, no hard feelings. But that's the only kind of confrontation. But if you're asking me, like, did Gary ever jump over the desk and throttle someone? No. The Halcyon thing, I mean, if you watch the Halcyon demo, Gary starts to lose his patience, but he doesn't like it. But like, even when he wrote about it years later in his memoir, he points out that he basically had pity for the guy because his demo didn't work.
Well, I mean, yeah.
But no, there was no. I can't think of any. At least in the episodes I've screened so far, no, nothing.
Yeah, because I mean, episodes like there's the famous episode. It's probably the most watched one online, where both the Atari ST and the Amiga are shown, and Jack Tramiel is there to show it off. Yeah, Jack was that whole episode was basically Jack. But I mean, the two machines are demoed completely separately on the same table, but clearly, they demo the one, then they cut, and when they come back, the other machine has been set up with different people. I mean, it would have been interesting to have, both the Amiga and the ST standing next to each other to, run them through their paces or something, but
I don't think either company would have ever agreed to that.
And this is why. I mean, and this is where I'd love to get more insight into the production of the show, just to find out how they managed the personalities and the interests of the companies versus the interests of the show to be neutral and simply to demonstrate stuff without becoming an advertisement.
Well, it's funny. Earlier I alluded to the story about Chaffee approaching Apple about being the underwriter, and Steve Jobs disagreeing with it. And Chaffee said the reason Steve Jobs came out and said, why would we finance a program that's going to advertise our competitors? And okay. I mean, I could sort of see his point. He didn't have to be a jerk about it, but okay. I mean, that's a legitimate concern.
Definitely. I mean, I totally understand the concern and the conflict.
Well, and keep in mind, you talk about conflict. Keep in mind, after everything that went down between Digital Research and Microsoft and IBM, Gary would be on the show when Microsoft people were there to talk about Microsoft products. Now, it would usually be followed up with a demo of a competing DRI product.
I was about to say,
Gary insisted on equal time.
I clearly remember an episode where, it was Microsoft shows something in an operating system or...
Oh, I just covered one a few weeks ago. So another thing I should mention about Gary, and this is something, I knew the basic story of Gary and DRI. Something I had no idea about until I did this blog was he had another company.
Oh, really?
He had a company. He kind of like how, you remember, the story of how, like, Tripp wanted to do the 3DO and his board told him to go to hell and he did his own, he spun it off. Not quite as dramatic, but Gary was always interested in new software media, and he was very big into Laserdisc and CD-ROM, and he wanted DRI to get into the CD-ROM and DRI business, as early as 81, 82. And his board was like, no, we don't think that's a good idea. So he spun it off into a separate company. And originally the company was called Activenture. And then he got a call from Jim Levy. Or maybe it was Bruce Davis. I don't know at the time. But Activision was like, Gary, that name's a little too close to our name. Could you maybe change it? And so he ended up changing the name of the company to Knowledge Set.
Knowledge Set?
And one word, Knowledge Set. Knowledge, S-E-T. Okay. One word, Knowledge Set. And they actually produced the first CD-ROM encyclopedia for Groliers.
Oh, okay.
Wasn't a big seller because this was 1985, but
you got to start someplace.
But and the other part of the story, and I don't know if I know you interviewed one of Jack's kids.
Leonard,
kids, right? I don't know if you brought this up with Leonard. I did listen to your interview, but Jack, of course, the Digital Research did GEM for the Atari ST. GEM was for people who don't know, GEM was a graphical environment that was developed for DOS by DRI, which didn't quite take off for a variety of reasons I won't get into. But Knowledge Set also had a deal with Tramel's Atari to develop a CD-ROM drive for the ST. I want you to stop and think about that for a moment, Carl.
We've actually covered it on the show that there were several announcements of a CD-ROM drive for the ST.
The critical word being, of course, announcements.
And
was there an actual drive? There were some prototypes. There were some developer kits that got into the wild. But this was like I can't remember again. It was either 86, it was like 85 or 86. Jack announces at CES, we're going to have a $500 CD-ROM drive. In 1986?
Well,
no, Jack, you're not going to do that.
Jack. I mean, he's going to figure out a way to make it cheaper and better.
But Knowledge. Gary and his team at Knowledge Set actually built the demo unit for CES.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, I think they were going to basically develop the software and the formatting for the CD-ROM, but it just never went anywhere. And I mean, after a couple of years, when Gary realized he was far too early into the market, he ended up selling the company. It didn't last long. But I mean, Gary knew CD-ROM was going to take off.
Well, I mean, it was obvious that you needed a larger storage medium that was still something usable in a commercial sense. But yeah, it was just too early, especially with those access speeds.
Yeah. And again, so there's an episode on CD-ROM from March of '88 where, Microsoft just released Bookshelf, which was their first CD-ROM product, because Microsoft and Digital Research were both kind of the two big companies into CD-ROM. I mean, Bill Gates used to have an annual CD-ROM conference that Gary co-sponsored. So, they were still working together, even though they were rivals. I don't think it was ever the case that like Gary and Bill Gates were more.
No, enemies. We talked about this recently on the show a few months back in '83 that DRI just basically realizes they're not going to compete with the operating system, and they immediately begin to pivot into other applications that will run under MS-DOS.
Right, like again, Gem being sort of the most notable example. But it's funny. So Microsoft again, this shows you where CD-ROM is, because Microsoft is there showing Bookshelf, which is a multi-$100 reference library. Knowledge Set, Gary's there with Knowledge Set, and their CD-ROM demo for 1988 was a Boeing 757 maintenance manual.
Yeah, I saw that blog.
That was their big product.
Yeah.
That was their... Yeah, it's just kind of amusing as heck. Because again, that was the CD-ROM market, was reference materials. And if you're Boeing, you're glad to pay thousands of dollars for a CD-ROM drive, because think of all the paper.
Well, and also the fact that you can search it.
Exactly. And that's really what Knowledge Set did. What Knowledge Set was really doing was they were developing the search and retrieval software for CD-ROM. That was actually what they were doing.
And that was the thing that you needed to make that big data usable, that big data set. And so, but let's get back to Computer Chronicles for a moment. And obviously, the Gary Kildall story, spoiler alert, does not end well.
The short version of that is, around 1990, Gary decides to retire. He sells Digital Research. He retires from Computer Chronicles, I think, at the end of the 89-90 season, and he moves to Texas. He buys a big house, moves to Texas. Unfortunately, he died a few years later, and I don't really want to get into speculation as to the circumstances surrounding his death, because that's another kind of part of the Gary Kildall urban legend. He died in July 1994, so only about 4 years after he retired. What I can say from the news reporting is that he was out having dinner at a restaurant. He fell. He hit his head. They took him to the hospital. He was released. The next day, he was taken back to the hospital. He died of an internal hip bleed. There's been a lot of speculation over the years as to what happened in terms of Gary's overall health. I'm not going to engage in that speculation. I don't think it's appropriate, and I don't like reporting rumors or anything like that. But yeah, he died. He was 52. That's just terribly young for anyone, and it's sad because Gary passed away before the internet became a thing. Outside of sort of people like us who study this stuff, I think his name is largely forgotten now. In terms of the role he played, he's remembered at all. If he's remembered at all, it's for being on the show. But in terms of digital research and like even the stuff I just talked about, he was an early pioneer in CD-ROM, and that's a part of history that's almost completely lost.
Yeah,
today.
Sadly. I didn't even know about that involvement until you started talking about it.
Yeah, I didn't know until I started doing the research on it. Again, all I knew was about digital research and CPM, and that part of the business, his life. But it's sad. And Stewart actually did do an entire episode after Gary's passing, just sort of a tribute episode where they interviewed a lot of the people he'd worked with, and it's very clear that from all the accounts I've ever read from people who work with Gary, he was beloved. Mm. He was a guy that everybody who worked with him respected and liked him, and nobody wanted to see things end that way.
Yeah, he was a pioneer. CPM is so far ahead of its time, but he, just by missing that, or better said, CPM doesn't evolve fast enough to take itself to that next level. It needed a clear cut.
Well,
a new product would have been better.
The way I've come to look at it, and this is something you learn when you start writing about a lot of these early companies, I recently did a podcast about the history of WordStar, which was one of the early word processing programs. And WordStar was basically the dominant word processor during the CP/M era. And then once you get into the DOS era, it gets overthrown by WordPerfect. And then once you get into the Windows era, WordPerfect gets overthrown by Word, which, by the way, today is, I believe, the 40th anniversary of Word. At least that's what the tech press is saying. I don't know.
It's the precursor
I haven't double checked.
But yeah, we just talked about its introduction at CES.
But the reason I bring up WordStar, when I was doing the research on WordStar, this was another story where it was founded by this hobbyist, or he worked in the industry, but he was he'd never run a company before, and the founder of the company got pushed out by the venture capitalists, and the usual story. And when I was researching what happened. One of the executives who worked at the company in the early days said, basically the reason the venture capitalists had to come in and push the founder out was because the founder was hiring a bunch of inspired amateurs, not professionals. And I think the phrase inspired amateur is important because a lot of these companies, and I would put DRI in this mix, Gary was not a business guy. Gary was an academic. He was a PhD who kind of backed his way into running a commercial software company when there were very few commercial software companies. And I don't think he ever approached digital research as, I'm going to build a multi-billion-dollar company that dominates the software industry. I just don't think it was how he thought.
Yeah.
Well, and again, that's not to demean him or his accomplishment, but it's like, he's kind of the antithesis of Tripp, right? Like, Tripp Hawkins set out to make a company that was going to make a lot of money and become dominant in the field of gaming and entertainment software. Tripp was a professional making a professional business. A lot of these early companies, and George Morrow's company was among them too, Morrow Designs, a lot of these companies were kind of amateur operations. The people were smart. They were educated. They were smart people, but they didn't set out to make these giant companies. And once the market started to grow, people say that IBM set standards for the microcomputer market. I don't think that's really what happened. IBM professionalized the market. And IBM basically said, look, if you're going to build microcomputers at scale, you have to have a professional marketing and sales operation. One of the reasons that George Morrow's company failed, George's computers were good. If you go back and look at the historical accounts, Morrow Designs was making very good computers. I mean, George Morrow made one of the earliest portable computers, and it was a good machine. But George's idea of customer support was, well, they can join a user group.
Yeah, that's not going to get you very far.
And the other thing that guys like George did, a lot of these early pre-IBM PC companies like Osborne and Morrow, they thought it would be great to bundle software with their computer. So when you bought an Osborne 1 or you bought a Morrow Pivot, it came with WordStar. It came with VisiCalc or a clone of VisiCalc. It came with all the software, which was great for the customer, but it wasn't great for retailers, and those machines wouldn't sell in Computerland. Computerland wouldn't sell the Morrow computers because they're like, why would we sell a machine pre-bundled with our most expensive software? It's like, would Sears have sold the VCS if they bundled the top 5 VCS games with the machine at the same price? No. You bundle one game, you don't bundle 5.
Oh, you think that's bad? You should see some of the last packages for the Atari ST that came with like 30 games.
Jack believed in that approach because Jack was desperate.
Yeah,
but my point is when IBM came into the market, you didn't need IBM to create the technical standard for the PC because again, the technical standard was all off the shelf stuff anyway, and the BIOS was trivial to reverse engineer. What IBM did was basically say, okay, if the microcomputer industry is going to be a thing, it's got to be professionally run. And these inspired amateurs running these small hobbyist companies, they're not going to be able to survive in this environment. I mean, we saw the same thing in software, right?
Yeah. I mean, in software, you get to a point where you either have the infrastructure to make it work properly. This is when I talked to Ken Williams of Sierra. I mean,
right.
His realization, his dream really was to have the all-around software company. Games were just sort of a sideline. But he very quickly hits a wall with productivity software because he simply doesn't have the organizational skills to make sure that it is solid enough, that it is stable enough and error-free enough to be a reliable piece of a reliable working tool. Whereas, if a game has a bug, who the fuck cares?
Well, exactly.
Yeah. And
another thing you learn from looking at business software in particular, and I think what Ken's saying is interesting here, because a lot of these early business software companies that kind of went defunct in the 90s, your Ashton Tates, your VisiCorps, those kind of companies, all of these soft business companies became dominant in one part of business software. But then they tried to leverage that into getting into the other parts of the market. And they were all trying to do the same thing. Like, the spreadsheet company was trying to get into databases. The word processing company was trying to get into spreadsheet. And none of them could pull it off because none of them controlled the platform. Microsoft controlled the platform.
Yeah, of course.
And one thing I learned from doing the blog, I covered an episode. They did a 4-part series in 87 on business applications. And they were showing off Excel, which Microsoft Excel started on the Mac, not the PC.
Yeah.
That may have been the single, if you have to point to one thing that Microsoft did that made it the dominant company it became, that's the move. Debuting Excel on the Mac. And here's why I think that's the case. Because even though the Mac was a much smaller market back then, Microsoft understood that the future was going to be in the graphical interface. They knew their Windows interface was garbage in 85. They knew that. Nobody thought it was good. But they knew that within 5 to 10 years, once they perfected that interface, that was where the future of business software was. So they wanted to make sure they had the experience in developing applications for a GUI before anybody else did. And the problem is, a lot of these other companies, like Lotus 123 was the dominant spreadsheet on DOS. Lotus couldn't pull off the transition to Windows. They stayed on DOS too long, and all these other companies did. I mean, WordStar and WordPerfect had the same problem. None of them thought the graphical interface would really take in the mass business market, and they were too afraid of losing their market. They were too afraid of alienating their existing customers on DOS, and they were too slow to really move towards GUI. But Microsoft was preparing 5 years in advance for that transition, and that's the key reason they succeeded.
And I would go one step further and say that the real insight here is the fact that Microsoft was willing to develop for every platform.
That too,
and
right.
Which meant that they weren't married to their old systems. And this is really going back to Gary Kildall. What kills him is that CP/M was never going to be an upgradable system. It was going to always be married to the Z80 processor. There was no way to realistically upgrade that to a 16-bit processor. But he never brought himself to just say, okay, screw it, we're making an entirely new operating system from scratch.
Right.
And by being able to develop a brand new spreadsheet, remember, Microsoft has a spreadsheet on DOS at this point.
Right.
And it has a semi-GUI interface. But by being able to go to another operating system, they can start a whole new program from scratch that can then be brought over that is using a 16-bit processor and so forth. And that entirely new process. And Leonard Trammell, he brings this up in the interview. When they were looking for an operating system for the ST, they first go to Microsoft. And Microsoft says, sure, we can do it, but we need, I think he says, something like 2 years because we're going to write the whole thing from scratch in machine code for the new.
Yeah, Jack doesn't want to hear 2 years.
And they were like, no. And they go over to DRI, and DRI says, yeah, we can get it done in no time. We're just going to take what we already got and just recompile it. Does it ever run as smoothly as freshly written code would?
Although it's funny you bring that up, because when I did a blog post on the ST, I think it's when I covered that Jack Trammell episode, I think it was one of the early reviews of the ST, it might have been the Byte review, the operating, when they shipped out when Atari shipped out the review units, the operating system port wasn't complete yet.
Yeah.
So, and that was noted in some of the early reviews, is that the operating system the GIM part of it wasn't fully functional yet.
And that doesn't surprise me, because this whole thing, the timeline in which that machine was put together was insane. I mean, from the moment that Jack takes over the company. And
it's funny because I say this on the blog when I was covering that episode, and again, the one thing about the Chronicles is you do get a very good sense for where the conventional wisdom in the tech press is. The Macintosh was the most overhyped computer of 1984. The ST was the most overhyped computer of 1985.
Yeah.
Because they were all on board. Because I mentioned they used to do the commentaries. When George Morrow did his commentary, he gushed about the ST coming out. He hadn't reviewed the computer. What he was saying was, well, Jack Tramiel is one of the magic names in this industry, and he's going to pull this off.
Yeah.
And so there was in many respects, I think a lot of the tech pundits viewed Jack back then the way a lot of tech pundits later would view Jobs, as kind of this mythical figure who could just will his way into success.
Well, they did call it the Jackintosh for a reason.
I have been trying to track down where that comes from. I would love to know who actually coined Jackintosh. I asked Paul Schindler about it, and he didn't know. But I would love to know. It had to have started at one of the trade shows. I'm thinking it came out of CES.
Well, I'm keeping an eye on the reviews. Obviously, it's still too early in '83, but I am going to keep an eye out. Maybe I can identify at least a very early use of it. Now, but bringing it back to Computer Chronicles, because what you just mentioned is important, and everything we've talked about is important to set the stage for, number one, Kildall as a major player on the show, but also for the historical context and the historical importance of the Computer Chronicles. Because, yeah, we've got magazines from the time, we have newspaper articles, but barring Computer Chronicles, there's very little in the way of actually seeing and hearing these key players. There's no other forum except maybe the occasional news broadcast, which, you get like not even 10 seconds of the people talking. And here you get, full mini interviews with some of these key players. Where do you place the importance from a historical standpoint of Computer Chronicles as a document?
Well, much like the name of the show suggests, it was a chronicle. It was a chronicle. I think Stewart picked the name quite deliberately. I don't know if he thought it would be as much of a historical record as it ended up being, because, you don't know the show's going to run 20 years. I definitely agree. A lot. I've certainly learned about dozens of companies now that I would have had no knowledge of absent this program. Unless you were to actually go back through every old computer magazine, a lot of these smaller companies that came and went, and some of them had a decent influence. I think without a record like the Chronicles, a lot of these companies would just get lost to history. That's true.
Now, but I think, just from my feel, obviously I haven't watched as much of it as you have. I think what you said earlier about the general feel or the general sentiment in the computer journalism ecosystem,
right,
at each individual moment in time is encapsulated here probably better than an actual overview of the realities of the market.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the limitations of the program is it's very much, particularly in the early years, it changes somewhat later on, but certainly in the period I'm currently covering, it's very much a Silicon Valley insider type of show. And so you're really getting the view from Silicon Valley. And look, one reason they don't talk about the NES, Nintendo's a Japanese company. There's a news segment. It's not in the main show. It's in the news segment. The newsreader was reading the copy. Stewart didn't do the segment. The newsreader opened a story by saying, and this is what she said, "It's bad enough that Nintendo controls the North American video game market." And this was a story about the antitrust lawsuit from Atari Games, I believe.
Okay.
But it was like they literally just editorialized it. Oh well, going back to that first season, when they're doing all these academic discussions, pretty much every episode, somebody says, "What about the threat of the Japanese? What about the threat of the Japanese?"
Well, yeah, I mean, it's 83. The MSX is there with every major Japanese.
Oh yeah, there was a whole episode. There's a whole episode where Stewart goes to Japan. There's a whole location episode in Japan, and they do a whole thing. They interview Kei Nishi, and they talk about, is MSX going to be a thing? Is MSX going to be a thing? No, MSX wasn't a thing, at least in this country. But
yeah.
But so it certainly in the early seasons, it's a very Silicon Valley centered. Not America first. That's pushing it a little too far. But yeah, it's very much Silicon Valley conventional wisdom.
Yeah, and also remember, Nintendo of America is up in Seattle. It's far, far away.
No, Microsoft was too, and they got plenty of good.
That's true. But I mean, Microsoft.
I'm using Silicon Valley as a stand-in for the American tech industry as a whole.
That's true.
I mean, they remember Stewart was based in Pennsylvania at this point, so they would go to places like Carnegie Mellon or MIT. I mean, so they were. It wasn't like they were only interviewing people in the Valley. I mean, I don't mean to give that.
And that also explains the at least one time that he goes to the Commodore campus.
Oh yeah. Does a stand-up shot of Commodore.
Yeah.
By the way, this is a little, well, it's on topic, but you want to know the craziest thing I discovered in doing all these recaps?
Yeah, please.
I discovered what has to be the stupidest coincidence in history on this show. So there were 2 episodes that aired back to back. One of them was about computers and politics, and Stewart goes to Washington. He interviews a couple of congressmen who are like the 2 congressmen who know how to use a computer. Which I'm guessing today is probably also still true. But and he interviews a congressman named Ed Zhao, who was actually the congressman who represented Silicon Valley in those days. In the next episode, it was either the episode before or after this episode, I can't remember which order, but in an adjoining episode, which was on a completely different topic, one of the in-studio guests is a guy named Nat Goldhaber, who was running a small tech company at the time. Ed Zhao and Nat Goldhaber have one very crazy thing in common. They were both unsuccessful candidates for the Reform Party vice presidential nomination.
Wow.
Now, I probably have to explain a few things to the audience here. I assume you know what the Reform Party was.
Yes.
But, so, back in 1992, the U.S. presidential election had a third candidate. Normally you only have 2, the Democratic and the Republican candidate. That year there was a third candidate named Ross Perot, who actually ran a tech company. He ran a big defense contractor in the 80s. And was actually one of Steve Jobs' backers at Next.
Yeah.
So Perot self-finances this third-party presidential bid. And he gets like 20%, like 19-20% of the vote. After the election, he puts his political organization into creating a new political party called the Reform Party. In 1996, so this is the first election with the Reform Party, Perot ends up running again under the Reform Party banner. But he faced a primary challenger, the former governor of Colorado, Richard Lamb. Well, Lamb picked Ed Zhao as his running mate had he won the nomination, which they didn't. 4 years later, the Reform Party, Perot's out of the picture at this point. 4 years later, there are 2 different factions in the Reform Party vying for power, or vying for control of this useless party. And Nat Goldhaber is the unsuccessful vice presidential candidate from the losing faction.
Wow.
So, I mean, just the fact they were in back-to-back episodes of the Chronicles in the 80s, and they share this ridiculous... this means nothing in the grand scheme of things. I just can't help... But I was going to do a podcast on this, but I decided not to for other reasons. But I figured I'd give you that as a free anecdote.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, it's so weird, but I guess it also shows the.
I should point out Nat Goldhaber was in politics before he got into tech, and so I mean it wasn't completely out of nowhere that he got into politics, but it just the Reform Party connection is just so random.
Well, and I mean you got a feeling, like you said, Ross Perot had been in the tech sector. He had also had a bit of a not a directly elected, but He had been in government in Texas through, it was, I think, Secretary of Education or some similar thing back in the 80s. I
didn't know that. I don't know much about it. I don't remember much about his background.
If you read Friday Night Lights, the novel.
I haven't read it. I've heard of it. But
yeah, the novel is definitely worth reading. He's one of the antagonists of this town, this oil town that's obsessed with their football team, because he's
I know what it's about.
Saying, why are you spending so much goddamn I'm trying to not fall into a really bad Dana Carvey impersonation of Ross Perot.
Yeah,
now.
I know. That's the thing. I only remember the Dana Carvey impersonation. I don't actually remember the real Ross Perot.
Oh, I was actually living in Germany at the time. I remember in the middle of the night, I had a little radio. Can I finish? Yeah, I could actually listen to the presidential debates. And so I was sitting there listening to the presidential debates at night back in the pre-internet days. But yeah, so the Ross Perot thing was, like, why are you wasting all this time and energy on football? You should be educating, getting, computers going and stuff like this. So that's why I knew about that background in the 80s.
Yeah. Anyhow, so do you have another question? I think it's on track there. Okay, with that silliness.
So we have this show that, it's not commercially bound to any one company. It's in a sector where there's constantly news to report and new innovations to talk about. So, like you said, it runs for 20 years. It's, by any standards, that would be an extremely successful program. And it's doing it on a shoestring budget, so that also helps the longevity of the program.
Yeah, so I remember somebody said to me online a while back, a fan of the blog and the show said to me, well, wouldn't it be great if they could bring back the show like it was? And I'm like, I don't think we could build a set that cheap anymore.
Oh, you could. Now it would just be, a digital background.
No, it would look too good. It would look too good, though, is my point. Like, even if you try, it's like, it's just, that's that original set. Ooh.
Yeah, that very original set, and then later on the one they had in the last couple seasons that kind of looked like a couple of little tables that he would just
should we actually talk about how the show kind of evolved then?
Yeah, we should. So the original setup of they're sitting at a table and then just basically
there's basically
people.
There's basically kind of three phases of the program. So the first phase is from roughly 83 to 90. It's sort of the Gary Kildall period, where Gary is the main co-host, and they're doing the roundtable in the College of San Mateo studio. After Gary leaves, they actually move production away from KCSN. They actually have they rent a commercial facility somewhere in the Bay Area. It's a company called Television Associates. And this, if you've seen these episodes from the early 90s, it's still the roundtable, but now it's just like the solid blue wall background. They don't have the fake skyline anymore. And at that point, it's still pretty much the same show, except that now it's just rotating co-hosts. There's no longer a permanent co-host. Some weeks it's Paul Schindler, some weeks it's Jan Lewis, some weeks it's, there's like a bunch of people who rotate. Then as we get into the internet era, 94 or so, that's when the show evolves into its final form, where they have a set that sort of resembles like I don't know if it's supposed to resemble like a computer store or a computer repair shop. And it's basically, there's these three tables and Stewart just goes from table to table for each demo. And I think I assume they did that because that way everybody could set their demos up in advance. Because one thing you see a lot in this 80s period is because they usually had 2 demos per segment. And so the first person would do their demo, and Stewart's like, okay, could you hand your keyboard over to the other person and put the floppy disk in to set up the next demo? And that would waste valuable seconds. So I think when they switched to that other model in the 90s, it was because that way every demo could just get set up and he could just go right to the next demo and not have to waste any time.
Yeah, and it also
at that point, they're not doing the roundtables or the co-hosts anymore. Basically, it's just sort of they're still doing the tape segments, but it's basically just Stewart going from demo to demo with the tape segments, and they're not really doing the roundtable format anymore with the co-host.
Gotcha. Yeah. Now seemed to also kill a little bit of the conversation that would be engaged in.
Yeah. Well, and, it's funny because people say it to me online, and I know Stewart has said in interviews, the number one thing people will say to Stewart Chaffee is, why were you always cutting people off? Because he was trying to squeeze a lot into 22 minutes.
Yeah.
It was a 22-minute show before you add on, there were no commercials, but you had to leave 6 minutes for the random access and then for the underwriter message. So, they were doing, some of the shows I reviewed, they were doing 5 or 6 segments per show with the remote. So, he kept things moving at a very brisk pace.
Well,
and over time, I think that's why a lot of the conversation got lost, because he just wanted to move. He just wanted to show as much as he could in that 20-minute period.
And it almost feels like it lost its focus.
I haven't gotten to the 90s episodes, and I've only watched a handful of them, so I don't want to get too ahead of myself. I think what I would say is the show definitely became much more consumer-focused. I think Stewart, as the years went on, he was less interested in the pie in the sky or sort of industry stuff, and it was just more about what's on shelves now that customers might want to buy.
Yeah, and I think maybe that was because of the loss of the co-host. No longer having those, industry
it was
veterans.
It was an intentional format change. If he wanted to keep doing it that way, he would have kept doing it that way.
Yeah.
But I think he reached a point where I think part of it, too, was the industry was just so much bigger. There was more stuff.
That's true, too.
Think about it. You go back to that first computer games episode we talked about. They're talking about Space Shuttle for the VCS.
Yeah.
Today, when you're doing that show in '94, you have hundreds of games, not just a couple of dozen that you might want to pick. There was just more stuff to talk about. So. Yeah.
And also, by then, the show had a bigger reach to get a hold of, the representatives and so forth.
At their peak in the U.S., they were on about 200 stations.
That's a very large footprint. You are reaching a huge chunk of the population.
Yeah, again, at least as far as every place I've lived, every place has a PBS station. It may not be a great station, but PBS had a national. You could get PBS just about anywhere in this country.
Yeah. So, and I'm just looking up number of PBS stations in the U.S. is what? 350. So, yeah, that's a huge percentage.
Yeah.
Now, why does the show, why or how or both does the show end up ending?
Well, there is one other thing I think we need to mention in this period, which is, I don't have the exact dates in front of me, but it would have been after '94. Stewart Chaffee actually starts a second program that runs concurrent to Chronicles called Net Cafe.
Ah.
I don't know if you can get those online. They're on the archive. And Net Cafe was a much different show. It was Computer Chronicles for the hipsters. And it was also PBS. It wasn't a commercial show. It was still a PBS program, but it was focused on internet culture. And at least in the first year, I think it aired for 5 or 6 years. In the first season, it was actually taped at an internet cafe in San Francisco. They would tape it overnight, like from 7 o'clock at night until like 2 in the morning.
Oh, okay.
And so he had 2 shows running concurrently at that point in the late 90s.
Yeah.
And basically, the end is basically, there's no great dramatic story. It's just the show comes to an end at the end of 2001, I think 2002. And basically, it's just Chaffee couldn't find funding anymore. There was plenty of other computer media, especially with the internet now in full swing, and it just kind of they just had they had their day. There really wasn't any kind of dramatic story as far as I know.
Yeah, no, it also makes sense. Once you get the internet going, why do you need to watch a TV show for it? And it's also in the late 90s. CNET has a couple of shows running on the Sci-Fi Channel at that point that are covering a lot of the same material.
But yeah, it was December of 2002 when the official announcement came down that they were gonna cease production, and NetCafe also ceased production at that time. So he basically shut down the entire operation at that point.
And where does Chaffee go after that?
He starts his own kind of consulting company, and as far as I know, he basically is a consultant on TV production projects for most of the 2000s. I know at one point in the late 90s, he tried to start up an internet talk radio network called About.com, which I don't think was a tech thing. It was just sort of internet talk radio, podcasting before podcasting, basically. But I don't think that really went anywhere. But no, he basically just got into like TV production consulting, as far as I know. He's still alive. He's in his early 80s now. I know he recently had some very serious back surgery.
Oh.
At least that's what he said. He was posting on Twitter or whatever we're calling Twitter now, every so often. But he is still with us and, still alive. I know a few years ago he did a podcast interview. I think he was talking to Randy Kindig over at the Antic podcast. And he was saying that he was working on a book. Like, he was working on a book about the show, but I have no idea what the status of that project is. I mean, this was he was saying this like 4 or 5 years ago, so I don't know where he is in that process.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a shame for him not to be able to do that, because he would be able to give better insight into a lot of the people that made up the industry and the feel of the industry, basically on a moment-to-moment basis in most people, because most of the insiders just saw what was going on in their companies. They'd get occasional rumors from elsewhere, but they didn't have that direct access that he would have had. Now, looking at Computer Chronicles, you've obviously invested a lot of time. You've chosen this particular subject matter for this very, very large project that you're undertaking. What do you think, or what is your hope for the end result of the project as a whole, and what has been the biggest surprise so far while going through the archives?
Well, I don't know what the end goal is, other than to just recap the rest of the series. It has kind of a self-defined endpoint. I mean, I'm 105 shows in, or 105 blog posts in. I think altogether there's maybe 460 episodes. So I have a while to go. So I'm really just taking it one show at a time at this point. I'm not, this is, I don't think of myself as any kind of historian in the sense that I'm not trying to prove a thesis. I'm just sort of taking everything as it comes along. And frankly, you say, what's the thing I've learned? What I've learned is really the history of the industry. I'm learning about the industry as I go through all this, because I didn't have a lot of knowledge about how the industry evolved. So, I mean, in terms of a particular surprise, I don't know about surprise, but I've definitely come across a lot of interesting stories that I wouldn't have otherwise thought to look into. For example, I've done a couple of blog posts, and I've even done a podcast kind of about the early history of tax software, which I find kind of fascinating. And that's not the kind of thing you would pick up on your own if you weren't doing this kind of a project. You're not going to sit down and read a history of TurboTax. But when you see the guy who made Turbo, by the way, if I don't know, are you a baseball fan at all, Carl?
No, I can't say I am.
Well, I know Alex is, so this is a shout. This is for Alex, I suppose. But as we're recording this, the Arizona Diamondbacks have made the World Series in baseball. And one of the owners of the Diamondbacks is the guy who created TurboTax.
Makes sense.
Mike Chipman. And I saw him at the start of his company when it was literally a husband and wife company operating out of their home. And he was on Computer Chronicles talking about his little program TurboTax, and, which is now the dominant tax software in this country. And, getting to dig into the story of how TurboTax kind of became this behemoth and all the twists and turns that company and its various owners went through. I don't know if surprise is the right word, but again, that's not the kind of story I would have ever looked into had I not started this project. Like, I might read it, like, I could read a history, like, I would read Alex's book about video game history if I wasn't doing this. But I wouldn't have read a book about tax software history if I didn't do this.
As someone who has a similar experience with his own mega project, I totally get it. I totally get it.
Obviously, we're kind of doing a very similar thing in a different way. Yours is probably even broader than mine because you're looking at all different kinds of sources in different industries. I'm just looking at one show.
Exactly. But still, you come across things that you didn't know were going to fascinate you until you found out about them, and then they fascinate you.
Well, a good example, and I mean, this is, I try not to go down rabbit holes, because I know when you're doing any kind of, this kind of history, it is very easy to go down rabbit holes. One rabbit hole I did go down, and I just did, this was the last podcast of mine that I released, was, you know, at the beginning of the program, Stuart would always have like a prop. He would always like if they were talking about something, here's an example of the thing we're going to be talking about today. And they were doing an episode on computers and gambling. So this was around 87 or so. And he pulls out this device that looks like a calculator. And he doesn't even say the name of it. And he's like, you know, Gary, this came out a few years ago. Or I think it was George Morrow was hosting that week. You know, George, this device came out a few years ago, and it's supposed to help you bet on horses at the track. And I'm like, what the hell is this thing? Like, he doesn't even say what it is. It turns out this came from Mattel Electronics.
Really?
Mattel Electronics released the Mattel Electronics Horse Race Analyzer.
Wow.
This was a real thing. At first, I didn't believe this was a real thing. And I did a whole podcast. And again, this thing appears for 5 seconds in the show, and I end up, you know, writing a blog post about it, and then doing a whole podcast about it, because it's like, this thing is so stupid that somebody needs to make a record of a thing this dumb.
I cannot say that I disagree, considering that I've already recorded 2 lengthy interviews about Cadabroscope. So,
oh dear.
Yeah. All I gotta say is, and I've talked to at least 2 other people about it, and I'm hoping to get a 3rd interview about it, because I'm just obsessed with something that just happened to show up in a sideline that has nothing to do with actual video games. So it's all good.
But the other thing too is, I would say the other thing you learn from doing this kind of project is you also get a lot of insight. You know, you do get a lot of insights into companies. You know, companies that we know the names of and we think we know a lot about, but then you learn something new about the company. Like I've been doing a deep dive recently for an upcoming podcast on the whole history of Activision getting into HyperCard. Which to me is a really, because the season, I'm covering season 5 of Chronicles, and this is the season of HyperCard. You know, because HyperCard came out at the start of the season. The first episode of the season was literally about HyperCard.
Yeah.
And so, and they demonstrated some of the Activision stuff they were really, Activision was the first major commercial software company to get into HyperCard. And it's like, what was that all about? Because it seemed, out of context, it doesn't make any sense, right? Like, if you talk to someone today about Activision getting into Macintosh productivity software, it sounds like they lost their minds. But when you start looking into it, you realize, there's a reason they did this. It didn't work out for them, but there was a defensible logic and business plan behind what they were trying to do.
Interesting. It's very interesting because just today I ran across a mention in a German magazine dated September of 1983 where they mention they're doing a report on the July CES that
right.
Activision is starting to look into productivity software on computers.
Well, they were already doing other productivity software before HyperCard.
Well, yeah, but in 1983, this was news.
Well, and again, you think about it, because sort of the 3 big home software companies in this 87 period I'm looking into now, the home software companies were the big names were basically Broderbund, Electronic Arts, and Activision, and all of them were into productivity software. None of them were doing just games because the computer game market wasn't that big.
Yeah.
It just wasn't a very big market.
You needed to do it, and let's face it, Microsoft had some stuff out for machines like the Commodore 64. Their Z80 card for the Apple II was getting long in the tooth because it required CP/M. So if you were going to try to sell productivity software to the home computer market, it was going to come from the companies that are already developing software for these relatively limited machines that needed to be programmed really, really well and specific to those machines in order to.
And I think to the extent that a lot of these home productivity programs never really took off. I mean, there were exceptions. Broderbund had a lot of success in that field. But to the extent that the Activisions and EAs never got that kind of success, part of it is just the difference in the market. I mean, and this is another thing I've really started to hone in on in my own writing. There is a giant chasm between home software and business software. Activision could sell a home word processor or database for $50 or $60. DBase 4 was $700. Business software was almost 10 times the cost in this period of home software. And another thing, this is something I want to start looking into as I get into upcoming episodes. Copy protection fell apart in the business software market very quickly. Whereas in game software, it never fell apart, right? I mean, the game companies were always trying to finagle copy protection. And again, it comes down to that price differential. If you're a business and if you're buying 100 copies of WordStar at several $100s each, you do not want to be told you can't copy that disk to the hard drive. But if you're selling a $50 or $60 game and you're Activision, you don't care. You don't care if the customer gets pissed off because they're probably just going to pirate it anyway.
Plus, they probably don't own a hard drive to begin with.
Well, that too, right? I mean, hard drives are still new, but even just making regular copies. But
yeah.
But there's actually a great quote. You asked earlier about confrontation. Again, I wouldn't really call this a confrontation on the show, but there was an episode where Gary got a little snippy with an Activision guy. It was actually the general counsel at Activision. I forget his name. This guy was not a. This was a professional IP lawyer. This wasn't like a Bruce Davis kind of guy. And the episode was about piracy. That was the topic. And and keep in mind, Gary Kildall ran one of the 10 largest software companies in the United States at this point. And he was saying to Activision's guy, why are you being such jerks about copy protection? Not in those words. But he's like, why can't I copy a program to my hard drive? And the Activision guy was having none of it. And and I remember his response was, and he was very lawyer. He was a lawyer, like a gentleman lawyer, he wasn't trying to fight with Gary, but he was basically saying, look, you don't need to, a customer doesn't need to back up their disk. If their disk is unusable, we'll send them a replacement. Any reputable software company will warranty their software for a year. The customer doesn't need to make backups.
Oh my goodness.
And again, on the one hand, yeah, that sounds ludicrous, but I can sort of see where they're coming from on this. Sort of.
Well, I mean...
Sort of.
I understand it. And number one, well, you've got a couple of issues here. Number one, this idea that, we'll warranty it for a year is already placing this idea that you're going to change out your software at a relatively...
But again, keep in mind, Activision was mostly a game company, and again, games tended to be fairly disposable.
Exactly.
Whereas again, a business software that logic doesn't work when you're selling DBase or Lotus.
Y2K, baby, Y2K.
There you go.
We're going to be using the same software 30 years from now.
But the other thing I think that was really interesting about that response. And this is something, again, if you think about just thinking about games in particular, Activision had customer support. They had a whole department of people who were answering phones. What game publisher today has customer support? Nobody does that anymore because everything's online. Today, if my game, I just bought a game from GOG that didn't work. I emailed GOG that's like, here, we'll credit your account. Great, here's your refund. Steam. What was it with Steam? Like Steam, you can return it within 4 hours of playing.
Yeah,
isn't that so? Like you don't. I mean, so but back. One of the Chronicles game episodes that I just covered one of the remote segments was, and again, this shows the show had no money because they wanted to send Wendy as close to the studio as possible. She did a whole segment about the customer support department at Electronic Arts. She interviewed the guys who were doing phone support. And telling story, the horror stories about parents complaining about their kids running up the long distance bill to call EA because they couldn't figure out how to win Bard's Tale. Or they get a call about, my dog ate my Starflight disc. They literally show that on camera, the dog ate a disc. Companies did have, the larger established publishers did have to provide a lot of support back then, which is something that's completely foreign to people today.
Yeah.
So that I think, too, is another example of how a show like The Chronicles can be important in showing how the industry's changed, for better or worse. But it's like, that's not something you'd even think. Like, if you talk to people who play games today, they can't conceive of a time when game companies had customer support lines.
Or came in a box with a manual.
Well, that too. But I mean, you can... But, I mean, people understand the concept, I think, of boxes even today, because collectors collect them, right? But it's like, How do you explain the idea of Sierra Online having a helpline?
Or in the early days, you called up the helpline and Roberta would answer from her kitchen.
Yeah, do you ever watch the channel Metal Jesus Rocks?
Yes.
Because he started out, Jason, who runs that channel, he started out in customer support at Sierra, and I remember he did a video years ago where he talked about how, everybody had to come in the day after Christmas to answer questions. Yeah. Because that's because Christmas, I think even Christmas Day, people, and it was questions like, how do I install the game? How do I beat this puzzle? And, when Wendy did the segment on EA, they were showing the binders that all the help desk people had to use. They had a binder for each game. So it's like if somebody called and needed to know how to beat this game, they had to look it up in the binder and say, okay, where are you stuck?
This is where those CD-ROMs would have really come in handy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that's one of the really important values of a show like Chronicles is that through a lot of the remote segments, you do get a little bit of the slice of life of how the industry was working behind the scenes. That's the kind of thing. Again, it's hard to explain today if you don't have a visual representation of it.
That's definitely true. And just seeing the images, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Seeing some person in a cubicle answering a phone and having those binders there gives you a different perspective. You can actually imagine what that must have been like. Whereas just a description isn't always going to give you that same feel.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, given what you've seen and what you know about this show and what it was able to do, and I think we've touched on this already, do you think that the phenomenon of Computer Chronicles, some visual video documentation, if you will, snapshot of the industry would still be possible today? One source where, you can bring in any executive, any producer and actually have something that is that overarching.
Probably not. Because I think it would. First of all, the industry's far too big today relative to where it was even 20 years. Even 20 years ago when the show went off the air, the industry's just too big to cover. I think on that kind of week to week, topic by topic basis. I also think it would be very difficult to get knowledgeable people on the show. One of the things that Stuart Chaffee always said, and I think he said this when he talked to Leo Laporte years ago, was the worst guests were the CEOs. Because the CEOs didn't know how their damn products run. You needed to get the engineers, you needed to get the people building the products in. And today I think it's a lot harder to get those people because, I think about Apple, for example. I know people who work at Apple, they're not allowed to talk to anybody. They can't do podcasts of any kind. They can't even do a personal podcast. It's banned under their contracts, as I understand it. No tech company, even though everything's more open in the sense that we have the internet and instant communication, tech companies have become much more closed-lipped than they were. 40 years ago. IBM, for a long time, IBM was the one company that would never appear on Chronicles. They never sent people to the show. That started to break down around this 88 period that I'm covering now. But in the first few years, whenever they talked about an IBM product, it was always somebody from the outside, because IBM just would not talk on camera to anybody. And, Apple's very much like that today, but I think a lot of tech companies are like that today. And so you're going to get the PR people, or you get the show-off CEOs who know very little. You're not going to get the small, because again, I think a lot of the charm of Chronicles, like I talked about the TurboTax guy. Michael Chipman was the guy who wrote TurboTax. He was the president of the company, but he wrote the program. This was not that different from gaming, right? Like how many of these early game companies, it was the person who founded the company also wrote the games. Your Richard Garriott's. And you don't really have, in gaming you have independent developers, of course. But in terms of the business side of the things, you don't have, who would be the Gary Kildall equivalent today? I'm not even sure who that would be.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So somebody who was not only a CEO of a company, but somebody who actually built the product.
Yeah, it would be difficult. You'd have to find somebody who's in their 70s.
Well, I'm saying, but just among modern companies today, you just don't have those kind of people anymore.
Yeah, you could try to get maybe, can't remember their names, the founders of Google. Those guys. Yeah. One of them on there, they would still be an equivalent of that.
Yeah, but I think a lot of those guys tend to fall into the whole tech bro trap of, they're going to start talking about Bitcoin. Or, it's sad. Like I remember seeing a thing like where, isn't it Will Wright's now into a lot of that crypto nonsense, and it's like that's just sad.
Yeah, the whole idea of the NFT crap has grabbed so many people. Nolan Bushnell went down that pipe, that route and stuff. And I don't want to I don't want to fall into the trap of everything was better in the old days, because it wasn't. But I mentioned George Morrow, for example, and I remember an episode. George would often fill in for Gary when he was out. And, again, George Morrow was a guy who built his own computer company and was, in the tech business going back to the 60s. So he was not a Luddite, and he was not afraid of new tech. But they were doing an episode about computers and art. This was around 85, 86. And this is when some of the very early tools you could use for making art on computers was out. And I remember George making a very deliberate point saying, Stuart, it's great that we're developing this stuff, but we can never let the computer replace the artist. The computer has to serve the artist, not the other way around. And fast forward 40 years to all this AI art nonsense. And it would be interesting to have a show like Computer Chronicles that could, in retrospect, give us that development. Yeah,
but again, I don't think the people who are known in the industry today and would have that level of prominence, they tend to be the people who fall for whatever's new and hot. Today, you don't have shows like Chronicles because now you have 1,000 tech podcasts.
Yeah.
And, and those podcasts are mostly about, not to be indelicate, but most of these tech podcasts are FOMO junkies. It's how can I get rid of the iPhone I bought a year ago because there's a new iPhone out?
Yeah.
And, again, Chronicles did plenty of things where they talked about speculative future tech. But I do think, particularly in the 80s version of the show, I do think it was grounded by a sense. I think it was grounded in the sense that I think Stuart Chaffee in particular was very much about practicality. Because he would always be asking, like even when they had some of this pie in the sky stuff on the show, he would always ask, okay, but what's the practical value? Like, why would anybody buy this?
Yeah.
And today, so much of the tech media is focused on potential rather than practical value.
Well, and this is why I think the Kildall years work so well, because there always was that balance between Chaffee and Kildall.
Yeah.
Where Kildall, as the technical guy, is seeing the potential. He's seeing, what are you laying the groundwork for?
Kildall was the technical guy, yeah.
Yeah. And Chaffee could bring that user perspective of
and
also
But also, he was a journalist, and a journalist in the old, in the Watergate era sense. Not so he was actually trained to apply a certain degree of scrutiny to something.
Yeah,
and not just be, not just be credulous about every new pronouncement coming out of Apple. I'm not naming names, but you know who I'm talking about.
Oh, of course I know who you're talking about. I recognize the enemy when I see one. No, just kidding.
Yes.
But yeah, no, I mean, and seeing through the bullshit a little bit. So we have an important document for understanding these early phases of the computer industry, for understanding how the traditional analog medium of television, as it then existed, could be used to tell that story in real time. And we have someone who, in the modern day, without nostalgia for his Apple II days, or a little bit at least, is trying to put those stories as they were chronicled at the time into a historical perspective with the wonderful tool of hindsight. And doing an amazing job. I do enjoy reading your blog.
Thank you.
Yes. And
I enjoy your podcast.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, mutual admiration societies are a beautiful thing.
Exactly.
So, all of this being said, what would you like to say to the readers of your blog, the listeners of your podcast, and those who may now want to join their ranks after listening to all of this?
That's a good question. I never thought... it's funny because I write this blog kind of in a vacuum. I don't really think about who's reading this. Because this is a non-commercial hobby project. I'm not, I don't run a Patreon, or I'm not trying to raise any kind of money for this. This is just a hobby project. So I don't necessarily have, and I don't really have a thesis in terms of what the project is about, other than just I want to learn more about the industry as it evolved. And, I think in many respects I look at the blog almost as a reference. Like, I don't necessarily expect people to sit and read the entire blog, but if there's a particular episode or topic that you want to know more about, like if you watch an episode at random on YouTube and I want to know what happened to the people on that episode, I try to answer that question. So I think my answer is I look at the blog really as a reference source more than anything else. But it's not like I'm not writing, it's not like what Alex is doing with his book where he's trying to present an overall thesis about the history. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just I'm chronicling the Chronicles as silly as that sounds.
You're talking to a guy whose podcast is about, well, let's look at the news this month and all the press and put it into perspective. And there's no overall thesis. It's just trying to get an understanding of the evolution.
Yeah, I think you and I pretty much serve a similar purpose in that sense.
Yeah.
But ultimately I'm just running, I run a blog recapping a television show. It's just the most boring television show you can possibly recap.
Hey.
I enjoy it. It's not, this is not, we're not talking Game of Thrones here.
Exactly. This one actually has a good ending. No.
Actually, I think the actual final episode of the show was a 3-part travel episode. Was a 3-part look at the computer industry in Singapore.
Oh, I thought you meant Game of Thrones. Okay, yeah.
No, the ending of Chronicles. Because towards the end, they did a lot of travel log shows. So, so it was kind of a whimper at the end. I don't think there wasn't a final episode.
Yeah.
It's not the kind of show. It's not that kind of show.
Too bad. I mean, they should bring Shafei back for one more, nostalgia reunion show. And
unfortunately, George Morrow passed away in 2003, I believe. Obviously, Gary's long gone. Paul Schindler and Wendy Woods are still alive from the original group. I don't know about Jan Lewis was one of the other principal co-hosts. I don't know what happened to her. They could. There could be a reunion podcast or something, but. look, I mean, not everything needs to be revived. We're also living in the age of I think Computer Chronicles had its day, and as I said, I part of the reason the show was able to work, particularly in that 80s period, was because the industry was still small enough where you could do a show like that could cover pretty much every part of the industry and have knowledgeable enough people on.
That's true. And yeah, nowadays, like you said, it's just too diverse. It's too spread out. I mean, just alone if you start to include cell phone technologies and all the things that the internet has brought with it, you end up in a morass, and you would have to start delineating where are you going to draw the lines. Are you only going to cover desktop computing? Are you only going to cover...
And there's also kind of an interesting paradox, because even though the industry is much bigger, within individual segments there's a lot less competition.
True.
So for example, like when you're doing an episode about computer games, like when they did a 2-part look at computer games, it's like, okay, well, we have to cover the 2GS, we have to cover the Atari, we have to cover the Amiga. There was a lot of fragmentation. Like when they were doing that tax software episode, there were like 5 or 6 tax software programs on the market. Now it's just TurboTax.
That's true.
Pretty much. I mean, there are others, but it's like within individual, because the industry was younger, within each individual segment, there was a lot more competition. Now everything's much more monoculture focused.
That's true. I mean, and ultimately that has to do with standardization. I mean, what's the point in using a format that nobody else cares about? I mean, you want that portability, and a lot of that comes from the fact that the internet allows us to easily share files. We're no longer living on the island of our computer. I
mean, the very next episode I'm covering, the episode I'm writing up right now, and I'm going to write this weekend, March of 88, the topic is shareware.
Oh, nice.
And, that's... And I was actually thinking about this before, because, like, how do I explain shareware to a modern audience? And then it occurred to me, like, the in-app purchase is essentially the successor to shareware.
Yeah.
Because how many iPhone apps, like, you can download the app and try it out, but if you want to unlock it, that's basically the shareware concept in modern terms.
Yeah.
But the thing that interests me is when you go back to the 80s, when you go back to when shareware became a thing, one of the reasons that shareware existed was because, if you think about it, it was the only way back then to monetize online distribution of software. Because people were distributing shareware through bulletin boards. But you couldn't monetize that. Unless you were gonna post your credit card number on the BBS, which you probably shouldn't do. If you were giving away software on a bulletin board, but how do you monetize it? Well, you put a notice in there saying, and that's how the first shareware started out. I think that's that's literally how the early shareware guys were doing it. They were sharing stuff on BBSs and putting notices in there saying, if you like this program, send me $5.
Well, and it was also a way of having to bypass the extremely expensive retail model that required boxes, contact lists with retailers, and it was... Especially the North American market was so fragmented and difficult to access that unless you sold off your product to a big publisher, or you were publishing through a affiliated label system, you were going to do what Wild Bill Steely did in the early days. Call up every single computer store you could find and try to get, a couple of copies here, a couple of copies there.
Well, and again, like in the early days, you're talking around the early 80s, a lot of software companies were like, well, I'll just take out an ad in Byte magazine and see if anybody answers it.
Yeah, but I mean,
that's how DBase got started.
Yeah, I mean, and if you look through old issues of Computer Gaming World, there's tons, even going into the 90s, a ton of these, homebrew guys putting in an ad here, an ad there.
But the thing is, they would only sell like 50 copies doing that.
Exactly.
That's my point. Like do you know the story behind DBase, the database software?
No.
So, in brief, well, DBase is a great marketing story because they were the dominant database program in the 80s, and it was originally a solo developer. It was a guy who developed the program as a part-time project. He was working at NASA, actually. and he made this database program for himself, and he's like, well, this is pretty good. I'll take out an ad and bite and see if anybody wants to buy a copy. And he sold like 50 copies. And then he got contacted by a local mail order software distributor that was run by these two guys. And they're like, we got a couple of calls asking about your program. Could we distribute this for you? And he's like, sure, what do I got to lose, And that was how Ashton Tate got formed, the company that made DBase. Oh. And the funny thing is, if I asked you the question, who were the founders of Ashton Tate?
I'd probably say some guy called Ashton, another guy called Tate.
There was a Tate. There was a George Tate. But his partner was named Lashley, not Ashton. So the story of how this all came about was, so the database program the guy made was actually called Vulcan, because he was a Star Trek fan. And so Lashley and Tate agreed to distribute this database software. But they were just a mail order distributor. They'd never published anything before. So they go to see a friend of theirs who works in advertising. And the friend tells them, here's what you do. You call the program DBase 2. You don't call it DBase 1. If you call it DBase 2, people will think you worked all the bugs out. And he said, for the name of your publishing label, don't call it Lashley and Tate, call it Ashton Tate. And I don't know the exact... Now, nobody's ever given a reason on the record as to why the guy said Ashton. I suspect this is the same reasoning that led to the whole accolade acclaim thing, where it's like, you want to be as high up in the alphabet as you can be on a listing.
Yeah.
I suspect that's the actual reason. But that's how Ashton Tate got started. But again, it was literally just these two guys who got a phone call out of the blue asking about a database program, and they tracked down the solo developer, and, within a year or two, they had $1 million company.
Well, I mean, those are the things that are not impossible today, but almost impossible. Well, and the thing is too, they eventually got their VC backing, but that's the thing. Today, the venture capitalists are preemptively in everything now, right? Back then, you had to actually seek out the venture capital. Well, yes and no. I mean, Ed Zarin, the co-founder of Muse,
right.
He was approached back in 82, 83. And, but the problem was, he never really wanted to get too big, and he didn't know what to do with the money he did get.
No, I understand what you mean. I meant to say something a little bit different. What I meant was, today, the venture capital people basically just flood the zone.
Yeah.
Where they're back at hundreds of things hoping that one pays off. Back then, venture capital was actually selective about what it was doing.
That's true.
And they actually had standards, which they don't seem to have anymore. Like there was a venture capitalist who appeared on Chronicles one time. I think it was John Doerr. And they were talking about Apple. This was after Apple had run the 1984 ad for the Mac. And the venture capital guy couldn't have been more dismissive of the whole thing. To him, the 1984 ad was just the dumbest thing he'd ever seen. Because if the whole point is to get the business market excited about your computer, that ad isn't going to do it.
No.
And he was basically right. The business market didn't want the Macintosh. It's only when the desktop publishing stuff came along that the Mac was saved from disaster. Yeah. But, the venture capital back then was selective. They're not selective anymore. At least that's my impression.
Yeah, my impression is not that they're not selective, but that the model for making money off of venture capital, off of startups has changed. True. Because the ability to compensate stakeholders with stocks was not legal yet in those early days. That actually changes under the Reagan administration through deregulation. Yeah. And
also, too, Reagan cut the capital gains taxes, and that was a big. That's when the spigot really started to open.
That was another big one. And then, of course, when Reagan massively increases the national debt through printing and increases the money supply, something that
and defense spending. Don't forget defense spending.
Yeah, that massive increase in the money supply also meant that there was a predictable increase in the amount of money that was going to be in the stock market, which builds in an automatic increase in the value of stocks that relatively predictable, and it means that the money you put in today, if you make it to the IPO, there will be money to be had regardless of what happens. Something that previously just wasn't an option. So, yeah, those bets on everything isn't a question of, is the company ever going to make money? It's more a question of what's the odds of them making it to the IPO, because that will already cover my bet.
Yeah.
So I see it more as that they're no longer. It's not that they were more selective. It's that the goal of the investment has changed. It's no longer about investing in a company that's going to be profitable.
I can see that.
Yeah. But okay, we've gone way off topic here.
Yes.
But that is to be expected in this kind of an episode. So hopefully everybody who's listening is okay with that. We've had our closing comments, and I would then say, this is it, everybody. Thank you for listening. Remember, check out Mr. Oliva's blog and podcast. Links are in the show notes below. Check out the episodes of the Computer Chronicles, always linked in his blog posts. And
there is just one thing I wanted to add here before we get. And you can obviously get a lot of these episodes on YouTube, but the Internet Archive is the official repository, because Stuart Chaffee actually worked with the archive to digitize the episodes there. And he is somewhat touchy about people bringing up the YouTube versions of the video. So I always link to the archive now. I don't link to the YouTube videos.
Oh, excellent. And are those... I'm guessing they still suffer from the problem that the news segments are from the reruns, right?
In many cases, yeah. It depends. It depends. And there's also still about a couple of dozen episodes that are missing.
Gotcha.
But we are in the process of hunting them down and getting them, digitized.
Of course. Yeah, and it's really too bad, because the news segments would have been extremely interesting to be able to put the shows into.
Well, for you especially.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of the reasons why I don't really have the Computer Chronicles on my to-do list of things to use as sources, just because I can never truly say when they were recorded. And it's bitten me in the butt a couple of times, because I ran into that problem with the news segment not really matching up with where we should be in the history. Unfortunately. So, but hey, that's just the way the cookie crumbles.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Excellent. And everybody, have fun.